The smell of burnt copper and stale Maxwell House was the only thing keeping Staff Sergeant Elena Vance awake when the first ghost signal flickered across her monitor at 0314. A thin, jagged line of green light that shouldn't have existed in a valley as dead as the gumbad. She didn't reach for her radio or shout for the shift lead. Instead, she reached for a small, grease-stained notebook she'd carried since her basic training at Fort Jackson and wrote down a single number, 42. 8. It was the exact frequency of a harmonic resonance she hadn't heard since she was 12 years old, sitting in her father's garage in Lima, Ohio, watching him tune a Massey Ferguson tractor by placing his palm against the engine block and closing his eyes. He had been blind for 20 years, but he could hear a hairline crack in a cylinder head from across a crowded shop, and he had spent a decade teaching Elena that the world didn't just look like something. It sounded like something, and if you listened long enough, the sound never lied. Elena took a slow, deliberate sip of the lukewarm coffee, the grit of the grounds catching between her teeth. She was 32, with skin the color of parched earth and eyes that had seen too many screens in too many windowless rooms. Her uniform, a faded set of OCPs with the mountain tab of the 10th Mountain Division on her left shoulder, fit her like a second skin, worn thin at the elbows from years of leaning over signals arrays. She wasn't a techie, in the way the younger analysts were, kids from the suburbs who relied on algorithms to tell them what they were seeing. Elena was a SIGINT specialist who treated the electromagnetic spectrum like a physical landscape, a place with hills, valleys, and shadows where things could hide if they knew how to move. The outpost, officially designated Observation Post Grayback, was a jagged collection of HESCO barriers and plywood shacks perched on a ridgeline that looked like the spine of a prehistoric beast. It was a lonely, wind-scoured place where the only constant was the low-frequency hum of the diesel generators and the occasional thwack-thwack of a Black Hawk bringing in mail and MREs. To the rest of the detachment, Elena was the quiet woman who lived in the comms shack, the one who didn't join the nightly poker games and who always seemed to be staring at nothing. They called her the Ghost, not because she was scary, but because she had a way of being in a room without taking up any space. A shadow among the high testosterone noise of the infantrymen and the special forces operators who used Grayback as a jumping-off point for their mountain patrols. Major Thomas Miller, the commanding officer of the task force, was a man who believed in things he could see through a thermal scope or kick with a combat boot. He was West Point born and bred, with a jawline like a shovel, and a career trajectory that everyone assumed would end at the Pentagon. To Miller, Elena was a necessary piece of equipment, like a radio or a generator, useful until it broke and easily ignored until it was needed. He didn't understand the nuance of signals. He wanted actionable intelligence, which usually meant a set of coordinates he could call an airstrike on. Elena looked back at the monitor. The 42.8 signal was gone, replaced by the static floor of the valley's ambient noise, but she didn't look away. She knew that sound. It wasn't a radio transmission. It was a mechanical vibration, a specific frequency generated by a heavy-duty hydraulic pump, the kind used in deep-bore mining or the stabilization of heavy artillery. In a valley where there was supposed to be nothing but goats and dirt, that sound was a scream in a library. She stood up, her joints popping in the cold air of the shack. She moved with a slow, economical grace, her boots making almost no sound on the plywood floor. She walked to the small, scratched window and looked out into the darkness. The Gumbad Valley stretched out below them, a sea of ink under a moonless sky. Somewhere down there, someone was moving something very heavy, and they were doing it with a level of technical sophistication that the intelligence briefings said the local insurgents didn't possess. Elena had joined the army because of a Tuesday morning in 2004, when she realized the quiet life of an Ohio mechanic wasn't going to be enough to drown out the noise of a world that felt like it was breaking. She had a gift, a terrifying, hypersensitive awareness of patterns, and she had tried to bury it in grease and oil until the recruitment posters offered a way to make it matter. She had excelled in the Q course, not because she was the strongest or the fastest, though she held her own, but because she could solve a diagnostic problem on a sophisticated encryption device before the instructors had even finished explaining the malfunction. She didn't need the manual. She could hear where the electricity was getting stuck. She walked out of the comms shack and into the biting chill of the mountain night. The air smelled of wood smoke from the village 3 miles down the slope and the sharp, metallic tang of the perimeter wire. Near the mortar pit, Corporal Sticks, Morty was leaning against a stack of sandbags, a cigarette glowing in his hand. Sticks was 21, from a neighborhood in South Philly where people talked with their hands and didn't trust anyone who didn't have an accent. He was the only one on the base who really talked to Elena, mostly because he was the radio operator for the ODA, and he knew that when she told him to switch channels, the new one would always be clearer. "You're twitching, Sarge," Sticks said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He didn't turn around. He'd learned to read Elena's presence by the change in the air. "The valley's too quiet, Sticks," Elena said. She leaned against the Hesco, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "It's 3 in the morning. It's supposed to be quiet, even the goats are asleep. Not this kind of quiet. The seismic floor dropped 3 decibels 10 minutes ago. The insects stopped near the creek bed. Something's displacing the local noise." Sticks took a long drag of his cigarette. He didn't laugh. He'd seen Elena predict a mortar attack 20 minutes before the first tube popped because she'd noticed the way the local birds had suddenly shifted their nesting patterns. "You think they are moving?" "I think they are already there," Elena said. "I heard a hydraulic stabilizer, high pressure." "It's not a truck and it's not a tractor, it's a platform." "Miller ain't gonna like that," Sticks said, flicking his ash into the wind. "He's got the whole convoy staged for the sunrise push to the north. He thinks the valley is cleared. He spent 3 weeks mowing the grass, as he puts it." "He missed a spot," Elena said quietly. She turned and headed toward the Tactical Operations Center, or the TOC, a larger plywood structure reinforced with sandbags where Miller and his staff spent their days staring at maps and feeling important. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and ozone. Maps were pinned to the walls, covered in red and blue acetate overlays. Major Miller was hunched over a laptop, his face illuminated by the blue light of a satellite feed. He looked up as Elena entered, his brow furrowing. "Sergeant Vance," Miller said, his voice holding that edge of professional impatience he saved for anyone who wasn't an officer. "I thought you were on the night watch in the shack." "I am, sir. I'm reporting a signature, frequency 42.8, hydraulic resonance, approximately 6 miles south-southwest of our position, near the mouth of the Costi Pass." Miller leaned back, his chair creaking. He looked at his intelligence officer, a young captain named Reed who looked like he'd just stepped out of an Ivy League rowing club. Reed shook his head. "We've got birds over that sector right now, Sergeant," Reed said, tapping his screen. "Thermal is clear. No heat signatures larger than a coyote. No vehicle tracks on the main road. If there was a hydraulic platform out there, we'd see the exhaust." "They aren't on the road," Elena said, her voice flat and controlled. She didn't get angry when people doubted her. She just felt a weary kind of resignation. "And they aren't using internal combustion for the stabilizers. They're using a closed-loop electric system. It wouldn't show up on a standard thermal sweep if they've draped it in thermal blankets. But you can't mask the vibration. It's echoing off the granite in the pass." Miller sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "Sergeant, we have the 3rd Battalion moving through that pass in 4 hours. The entire operation depends on that route being open. I can't delay a 300-man movement because you heard a vibration on your hobby kit." "It's not a hobby kit, Major. It's a localized seismic sensor array that I recalibrated to detect subsurface movement. The frequency I heard is consistent with the deployment of a Chinese-made Type 02 mobile missile battery or a heavy-duty jamming suite. If they're in the Costi Pass, they're sitting in a dead zone for your satellite comms. As soon as the convoy enters the mouth, they'll be blind." Miller stood up, his height intended to be an intimidation tactic. Elena didn't move. She stood her ground, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her expression unreadable. "I've spent 3 weeks clearing this sector, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "We've had 0 contact for 72 hours. The insurgents are retreating. Every piece of real intel we have says they're pulling back to the border. Now you go back to your shack, you keep your ears open for actual radio traffic, and you leave the tactical decisions to the people who have to carry the rifles. Is that understood?" Elena felt the familiar heat of controlled rage prickling at the back of her neck. It wasn't about her ego. It was about the lives of the men who were about to drive into a meat grinder. She saw the retreat for what it was, a vacuum being created to draw them in. But she knew that saying, "I told you so," before it happened was a waste of breath. "Understood, sir," she said. She turned and walked out. She didn't go back to the comms shack. Instead, she went to the motor pool, a small patch of dirt where 2 Humvees and a battered LMTV were parked. She found her gear, a specialized Pelican case containing her portable signal interceptor, a ruggedized laptop, and a long-range directional antenna she'd modified herself using spare parts from a downed drone. Styx was waiting for her in the shadows of the motor pool. "He didn't listen, did he?" "He never listens to the silence, Styx. He only listens to the noise." "What are you doing?" "I'm going to get a better look." There's an old Russian observation post on the ridge above Kosti. If I can get the antenna up there, I can triangulate the source. I can give him a physical location. He can't ignore a grid coordinate. Styx looked at the dark mountains. "That's 4 miles of bad road, Vance." Outside the wire, alone. "I'm not alone," she said, patting the side of her Pelican case. "I've got everything I need." "I'm coming with you," Styx said, reaching for his rifle. "No, if you're missing from the TOC, they'll notice. You stay here, monitor the 40 megahertz band. If I'm right, they'll start a burst transmission the second the sun hits the valley floor. If you hear it, you tell Miller it's the ghost calling in the bill." Elena took the keys to the secondary Humvee, the shop truck that no one bothered to check. She drove out of the rear gate under the cover of a shift change, her lights off, using her NVGs to navigate the treacherous, rock-strewn path that led away from the base. The vehicle bounced and groaned, the sound of the engine feeling like a thunderclap in the stillness. She felt the weight of her choice. If she was wrong, she was AWOL and her career was over. If she was right, she might be the only person who could see the trap before it snapped shut. She drove for 40 minutes, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind mapping the sounds of the night. She heard the wind whistling through the dry scrub, the rhythmic clicking of the engine's cooling fan, the crunch of shale under the tires. When she reached the base of the ridge, she hid the Humvee in a dry wash and began the climb on foot. The gear was heavy, 60 pounds of electronics and batteries strapped to her back. But Elena didn't feel the weight. She felt the mission. She climbed with the steady, relentless pace of a woman who had spent her childhood hiking the Appalachian Trail, her breathing rhythmic and shallow. The air grew thinner as she ascended, the cold biting through her combat shirt. When she reached the summit of the ridge, she saw it, or rather, she heard it again. Down in the shadows of the Kosti Pass, a mile below her, the 42. 8 frequency was louder now. It wasn't just a vibration, it was a rhythmic thrum, like a giant heart beating in the earth. She set up her tripod, clicking the sections into place with practiced precision. She mounted the directional antenna and began sweeping the valley floor. On her laptop screen, the signal blossomed. It wasn't one source, it was 4. They were positioned in a diamond pattern at the narrowest part of the pass. They weren't just missile batteries. They were high-output electronic warfare suites, Russian-made Krasukha systems. They were designed to jam everything from GPS to satellite uplinks and low-Earth orbit imaging. They were the reason the drones couldn't see anything. The empty valley was an electronic hallucination. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a local insurgent cell. This was a professional military operation, supported by state-level hardware, and the 3rd Battalion was less than 2 hours from driving straight into the center of the diamond. She reached for her long-range radio, her fingers hovering over the transmit button. She needed to tell Miller. She needed to scream it. But as she tuned the frequency to the base's secure line, her headset filled with a sound that made her blood turn to ice. It wasn't static. It was a recorded loop. A child's voice, singing a nursery rhyme in a language she didn't recognize, played over a bed of white noise. It was an audio gate, a psychological warfare tactic used to let the listener know they were being watched. Then the ground beneath her feet shivered. A flash of light erupted from the base of the valley, a silent, searing white bloom that lit up the mountainside like a second sun. A split second later, the sound hit her, a roar that felt like a physical blow, knocking her back against the rocks. One of the Krasukha units had just gone active, but not for jamming. It had been hit by a preemptive strike. Elena scrambled back to her antenna. The retreating enemy wasn't retreating. They were being flushed, but by whom? Suddenly, her radio crackled to life. It wasn't Styx. It wasn't Miller. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice that belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead. "Sergeant Vance, I see you on the ridge," the voice said, clear and cold. "You always did have a habit of looking where you weren't supposed to. Pack up your toys and run, Elena. The Major isn't coming for you. In fact, he's the one who gave me your coordinates." The sky to the north began to glow with the first hint of dawn, and Elena realized with a terrifying clarity that she had been played. The mission wasn't a push to the north. The mission was a sacrifice, and she was the only witness who wasn't supposed to survive the night. She looked back toward OP Grayback, 4 miles away. Lights of the base were flickering. A thick column of black smoke was rising from the TOC. The retreat of the enemy was a choreographed movement, and as she watched, a fleet of unmarked black helicopters rose from the valley floor like hornets, heading not toward the pass, but toward the base she had just left. She was alone on a ridge, abandoned by her command, with an army of ghosts rising from the earth below her. She looked at her notebook at the number 42. 8. Then she looked at the antenna. "You want to play with the noise?" she whispered, her voice trembling but her hands steady. "Let's see how you like the silence." She didn't run, she didn't hide. She sat back down at the laptop and began to type, her fingers moving like a concert pianist's. She wasn't just an analyst anymore. She was the only person who knew the frequency of the trap, and if she couldn't stop the betrayal, she was going to make sure the entire world heard it happen. The first of the black helicopters crested the ridge, its searchlight cutting through the dark like a blade, searching for the woman who knew too much. Elena didn't blink. She waited until the light was inches from her boots, then she hit enter. The world didn't explode. It went silent. Every radio, every engine, every light within 5 miles simply ceased to function. The helicopter's rotors slowed, the engine dying midair, and for one beautiful, terrifying second, the only thing Elena could hear was the sound of her own heart, beating in the perfect American silence of a desert that was no longer empty. But the silence was only the beginning. As the helicopter began its terminal descent toward the rocks, Elena realized that by killing the power, she had also killed her only way home. She watched the craft vanish into the darkness below, the crash muffled by the distance, and she knew that when the sun finally cleared the peaks, she wouldn't be looking for a rescue. She would be looking for a way to finish a war that her own side had just started. She reached into her pack and pulled out a single, small object, a rusted screwdriver her father had given her the day she left Ohio. She pressed the handle against the granite of the ridge and put her ear to the metal. The earth was screaming. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance knew exactly what it was saying. The signal she had unleashed, a localized electromagnetic pulse of her own design, a feedback loop she'd theorized but never tested, had bought her minutes, not hours. The black helicopters were shielded, and while the pulse had knocked out their primary avionics, their backup systems would be cycling online within 90 seconds. She could already hear the rhythmic asterisk, click-clack asterisk of solenoids resetting in the distance, a sound like 1,000 mechanical insects waking up. Elena stood, her legs cramping from the cold and the tension. She didn't look at the crash site. She didn't have time for the dead. She collapsed the tripod, stripped the antenna, and shoved the gear back into the Pelican case. Her mind was a tactical overlay, calculating distances, terrain, and the specific acoustic shadows of the ridgeline. She knew this mountain better than the men who had built the OP. She knew where the wind carved out hollows that could hide a human heartbeat. "Styx," she whispered into her dead headset, knowing no one would hear. "I hope you stayed in the bunker." She began to move, not back toward the Humvee. That was a metal coffin now, a beacon for any thermal sensor that regained power. She moved laterally along the ridge toward a series of limestone caves she'd spotted on a geological survey weeks ago. The caves were deep, filled with iron-rich deposits that would act as a natural Faraday cage. If she could get inside, she could disappear. Behind her, the first of the helicopters regained its roar. The sound was different now, labored, the turbines whining as they struggled against the lingering ionization of the air. The searchlight flickered back to life, a jagged yellow eye sweeping the rocks. It was closer. She could smell the JP-8 fuel, a sharp, vinegary scent that cut through the mountain air. She reached the mouth of the first cave just as the light washed over the ridge behind her. She didn't dive. She stepped into the darkness with a controlled, fluid motion, her boots finding purchase on the slick stone. She didn't stop at the entrance. She went deep, feeling the walls with her left hand, the screwdriver still gripped in her right. The silence here was different. It was heavy, ancient. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet stone and old dust. Elena sat with her back against the cave wall, her breath coming in slow, measured gulps. She closed her eyes. She listened. Outside, the world was coming back to life. She heard the helicopters hovering, their downwash rattling the loose shale near the cave entrance. She heard the muffled shouts of men in the distance, English voices, American accents, but with a cadence that was wrong. It was the clipped, efficient speech of contractors, of Tier 1 operators who had stepped off the map and into the gray space of deniable operations. "Major Miller," she whispered to the darkness. "What did you sell us for?" The question wasn't for her. She knew the answer. She'd seen the budget discrepancies in the signals logs for months. Millions of dollars in black, funding being diverted from the ODA's maintenance accounts into a shell company called *Vanguard Tactical Solutions*. She'd assumed it was the usual Pentagon graft, the kind of low-level corruption that lubricated the wheels of war. She hadn't realized it was a down payment on a betrayal. The Krasika units in the valley hadn't been an enemy threat. They had been the cover. They were supposed to jam the communications of the 3rd Battalion so that when the insurgent ambush happened, no one would be able to call for help. The 3rd Battalion would be wiped out, the Krasika units would be captured as proof of foreign intervention, and Miller would walk away a hero who had survived a catastrophic intelligence failure. And Elena Vance, the woman who heard everything, was the only one who could prove the jamming was coming from within the house. She opened her Pelican case. The laptop screen was dead, the EMP had fried the motherboard. But Elena didn't need the screen. She reached into the side pocket and pulled out a small, handheld spectrum analyzer, a device the size of an old Game Boy. It was an analog unit, shielded in lead tape. She'd built it in the workshop in Lima, using parts from her father's old shortwave radios. It didn't have a screen. It had a needle. She turned it on. The needle jumped to the center of the dial. There was a transmission. It was coming from deeper inside the cave. Elena froze. Her heart, which she had fought so hard to keep steady, gave a violent thrum against her ribs. She wasn't alone in the Faraday cage. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for her screwdriver. She stood up and began to walk toward the back of the cave, her feet moving with the silence of a predator. The transmission was a low-frequency pulse, a rhythmic ping that felt like a needle pricking her brain. It wasn't human speech. It was a beacon. She rounded a sharp bend in the limestone and saw it. A small, matte black box sat on a flat rock, its LED indicator blinking a steady, rhythmic blue. It was a tactical relay, a bridge between the deep cave and a satellite uplink, and sitting next to the box, his back against the wall and a bandage wrapped around his thigh, was Corporal Styx Morty. He had his rifle across his lap, but he wasn't holding it. He was holding a handheld radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He looked up as Elena approached, his face pale and slick with sweat in the blue light of the beacon. "I knew you'd come here," Styx said, his voice a dry rasp. "It was the only place on your map you marked with a Z." "Z for 0 point," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The quietest place in the valley. Styx, what are you doing here?" "Miller. He knew you left," Styx said, wincing as he shifted his leg. "He sent me to retrieve you, but I saw the birds, Elena. I saw them take off from the hidden pad behind the fuel bladders. They weren't ours. They had the Vanguard logo on the tail." "How did you get out?" I didn't. I jumped. I was in the lead bird. When I realized they weren't going to the pass, I kicked the door and took my chances. Hit the scree slope about a mile down. My legs fucked, Sarge. But I kept the relay. Elena knelt beside him, her hands moving over his leg with the efficiency of a medic. The bone wasn't broken, but the gash was deep, the blood staining his OCPs a dark, muddy crimson. She pulled a tourniquet from her belt and tightened it above the wound. Sticks hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. "Why the beacon, Sticks?" "It's a burst transmitter," he said, handing her the radio. "I've been trying to get a signal out to Bagram, to the real command, but the Krasaka units. Even with the EMP you blew, the valley is still souped up with interference. I need more power. I need an antenna that isn't made of rock." Elena looked at the matte black box. It was a high-end piece of kit, but it was designed for line of sight. Inside this cave, it was screaming into a pillow. "We can't go back up," Elena said. "They're swarming the ridge. If we step out there with an active transmitter, they'll have a hellfire on our heads before the first packet sends." "So what do we do?" Sticks asked. "We sit here and wait for the sun. Once they find your Humvee, they'll start a grid search. They'll find this cave." Elena didn't answer. She was looking at the walls of the cave. She reached out and touched the stone. It was limestone, yes, but it was shot through with veins of magnetite and quartz. She pressed her screwdriver against a particularly thick vein of dark ore and put her ear to the handle. She didn't hear the helicopters. She didn't hear the wind. She heard the mountain. The Gumbad Range wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a geological tuning fork. The quartz veins acted as natural resonators. If she could vibrate the mountain at the right frequency, she wouldn't need an antenna. The entire ridge would become the transmitter. "Sticks," she said, her eyes wide and bright with a sudden manic clarity. "Give me your claymores." "My what?" "Your M18A1s. You have 2 in your pack. Give them to me." Sticks looked at her like she'd lost her mind, but he reached into his bag and pulled out the 2 olive-drab curved mines. "Sarge, if you're planning on blowing the entrance, it's just gonna bury us alive." "I'm not blowing the entrance," Elena said. She took the mines and began stripping the C4 explosive from the plastic casing. "I'm building a transducer." She spent the next 20 minutes in a fever of technical improvisation. She used the copper wiring from her directional antenna, the batteries from the Pelican case, and the raw C4 from the claymores. She didn't build a bomb. She built a high-pressure acoustic driver. She wedged the explosive-backed copper plates into a narrow fissure in the magnetite vein, connecting them to the tactical relay's output. "You're going to use the C4 too?" "What, shake the rock?" Sticks asked, watching her with a mix of awe and terror. "Not shake it, pulse it. I'm going to convert the digital signal of the relay into a series of micro-explosive vibrations. The quartz will translate that into a piezoelectric radio frequency. It's a trick the Soviets used in the 70s for deep-crust communication. It's messy, it's loud, and it'll probably kill the relay, but it'll punch through anything." "Will it work?" Elena looked at him, her face shadowed by the blue light. "My father once told me that if you hit a bell hard enough, it doesn't matter if the room is full of smoke. Everyone's still going to hear it ring." She connected the last wire. The blue light on the relay began to flicker rapidly, sensing the new, massive impedance. "I've got the data packet ready," Sticks said, holding up his ruggedized tablet. "It's everything. The logs, the GPS coordinates of the Vanguard pad, the audio of Miller giving the order to leave you behind. It's the whole coffin, Sarge." "Send it," Elena said. Sticks hit the button. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the cave groaned. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sound that lived below the range of human hearing, a deep, bone-rattling asterisk thrum asterisk that made the dust dance on the floor. The magnetite vein in the wall glowed with a faint, ghostly violet light as the quartz atoms were hammered by the acoustic pulse. Outside, the helicopters abruptly veered away from the ridge, their pilots likely deafened by the sudden, massive electromagnetic surge radiating from the very ground beneath them. The blue light on the relay flared once, blindingly bright, and then the box melted, a plume of acrid black smoke rising from its vents. The cave fell into total darkness. "Did it go?" Sticks whispered. Elena didn't answer. She was listening. The mountain was still ringing, a fading harmonic that vibrated in her teeth. She waited for the sound of the helicopters to return. She waited for the sound of boots on the shale. Minutes passed. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy silence from before. It was a waiting silence. Then, from far away over the ridge to the north, came a new sound. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the black helicopters. It was the screaming, high-velocity howl of two F-35s breaking the sound barrier. The cavalry wasn't just coming. They were coming in hot. They got it, Styx breathed, leaning his head back against the stone. They actually got it. Elena didn't cheer, she didn't smile. She reached out and took Styx's hand, her grip tight and steady. "We aren't out yet, Corporal. Those jets are going to level the Costi Pass. And once they're done with the pass, they're going to look for the source of that signal. We have to move." They emerged from the cave an hour later, the sky now a brilliant, bruising purple as the sun began to peek over the jagged teeth of the mountains. The valley below was a graveyard of smoke and fire. The Krasika units were twisted skeletons of metal, and the Vanguard helicopters were nowhere to be seen. But as they crested the final rise toward the hidden Humvee, a figure stepped out from behind a jagged rock. It was Major Miller. He was alone. His uniform was scorched, his face blackened by soot, but he held his M4 carbine with the steady, practiced ease of a man who had nothing left to lose. He looked at Elena, and for the first time he didn't look through her. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying respect. "I should have killed you in the shack, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice strangely calm. "I knew you were a freak, I just didn't realize you were a goddamn genius." "Drop the rifle, Major," Elena said. She didn't have her own weapon drawn, she just stood there, her hands at her sides. "The signal went out. Bagram knows. The 3rd Battalion is turning back. Your Vanguard friends are running for the border." Miller laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You think Bagram cares? You think the Army is going to admit their star major was selling out a battalion to a private contractor? No, Sergeant. They'll bury this. They'll bury me and they'll bury you, but I'm going to make sure you go first." He raised the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't dive for cover. She did something Miller didn't expect. She closed her eyes and tilted her head as if she were listening to a distant melody. "Do you hear that, Major?" she asked. "Hear what? There's nothing but wind." "Exactly," Elena said. "The wind is hitting the rocks at 60 miles per hour. It's creating a low-pressure vortex behind that ridge to your left. And in about 3 seconds, the nothing is going to get very loud." Before Miller could react, the air behind him didn't just move, it exploded. A search and rescue PAVE Hawk, flying nap of the earth and using the very acoustic shadow Elena had identified, roared over the ridgeline. The downwash was so violent it sent Miller sprawling, his rifle skittering across the shale. A team of Air Force pararescue men, PJ, dropped from the bird before it even touched the ground, their weapons trained on Miller before he could find his feet. Elena stood perfectly still as the PJs swarmed the area. One of them, a master sergeant with a weathered face, approached her. He looked at the smoking Pelican case, then at the mountain that was still faintly humming, and then at the woman who looked like she'd been carved out of the dirt she stood on. "Staff Sergeant Vance?" the PJ asked, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. "Yes," she said. "We received a signal. It was unusual. The commander of the 10th Mountain wants to see you, personally." Elena looked over at Styx, who was being lifted onto a litter by 2 other PJs. He gave her a weak thumbs up. Then she looked at Miller, who was being zip-tied and led toward the helicopter, his face a mask of shattered ambition. She didn't feel a sense of victory. She didn't feel the "I told you so" she'd imagined. She felt the weight of the night, the cost of the silence she'd broken. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in grease, C4 residue, and Styx blood. They were the hands of a mechanic from Ohio who had just dismantled a conspiracy with a screwdriver and a heartbeat. As she stepped into the belly of the PAVE Hawk, the master sergeant reached out to help her. "You okay, Sergeant? You look like you've been through a war." Elena sat down on the nylon bench, the vibration of the engine humming through her boots. She closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of the rotors, the frequency of the hydraulic lines, the specific American song of the machine taking her home. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "I just need a moment of silence." The helicopter rose, turning away from the smoking ruins of the Costi Pass. Below them, the desert was waking up, the sun spilling gold over the mountains. To anyone watching from the ground, it was just another day in a long, dusty war. But Elena Vance knew better. She knew the frequency of the truth, and she knew that from now on, whenever the world went quiet, people would finally start to listen. But the real test was yet to come. As the Pave Hawk gained altitude, Elena felt a familiar vibration in the floorboards, a rhythmic, coded pulse that wasn't coming from the helicopter's engine. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her analog spectrum analyzer. The needle was twitching. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a beacon. It was a response. Somewhere deep in the gray space beyond the mountains, someone had heard her bell ring, and they were ringing back. Elena leaned her head against the vibrating hull of the aircraft, a small, cold smile touching her lips. The Major was wrong about one thing. They weren't going to bury her. They were going to need her. Because the war she just ended was only the opening movement of a much larger, much louder symphony. She reached into her bag, pulled out her grease-stained notebook, and turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a new number, 88, 4, the frequency of a shadow. The Pave Hawk banked hard to the west, disappearing into the glare of the rising sun, leaving the silence of the Gumbad behind. But for Elena Vance, the silence was over. The world was finally loud enough for her to see. As the aircraft leveled out over the vast, shimmering expanse of the Afghan high desert, the master sergeant leaned back toward her, his expression a mix of curiosity and unease. He'd seen a lot of things in his 15 years of special operations, but he'd never seen a SIGINT analyst who looked like she could pull a satellite out of the sky with her bare hands. "Hey, Vance," he shouted over the noise. "That signal you sent, the one that rattled our teeth 3 counties over. What did you call it?" Elena looked out the open door at the receding mountains. She thought of her father in the shop in Ohio, his hands on the engine block, feeling the heartbeat of a machine no one else could fix. She thought of the silence she'd found in the cave and the way the quartz had hummed under her touch. "I didn't call it anything," she said. "Well, the boys back at the TOC are calling it something. They're calling it the ghost note." Elena nodded slowly. A ghost note. In music, it was a note that was felt more than it was heard, a rhythmic pulse that gave a song its soul without ever being the melody. It was the space between the sounds. It was the part that mattered most. "That fits," she whispered. The helicopter sped toward Bagram, toward a debriefing that would last for days, toward a future where she would never be just an analyst again. She knew the road ahead would be paved with more betrayals, more gray space, and more men like Miller who thought they could own the noise. But she wasn't afraid. She had the screwdriver. She had the notebook, and she had the gift. She watched the shadow of the helicopter race across the dunes below, a dark shape flicking over the sand like a needle on a dial. The desert looked empty, but Elena knew better. She knew that every grain of sand, every jagged rock, and every gust of wind had a frequency. And as long as she was listening, the enemy would never have a place to hide. The Pave Hawk crossed the perimeter of the airbase, the massive gray runways of Bagram stretching out like a promise of safety. But as the wheels touched down and the rotors began to slow, Elena felt the final, lingering vibration of the mountain fade from her bones. She stood up, her gear heavy on her shoulders, and stepped out onto the tarmac. The heat hit her like a wall, the familiar, dusty, American-scented heat of a forward operating base. She saw the huddle of high-ranking officers waiting for her near the hangar, their faces grim and expectant. She didn't hurry. She walked with her head up, her eyes scanning the horizon one last time. The Gumbad Valley was gone, hidden behind the haze of the desert, but she could still feel it. She could still hear the 42. 8. "Staff Sergeant Vance," a colonel said, stepping forward as she approached. He didn't offer a hand. He just looked at her with a piercing, analytical gaze. "I'm Colonel Hendricks. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, lead-shielded spectrum analyzer. She held it out, but she didn't let go until the colonel met her eyes. "It's not just a signal, Colonel," she said, her voice clear and hard as the mountain granite. "It's a map, and if you're going to follow it, you're going to need someone who knows how to read the silence." Hendricks took the device, his thumb brushing the lead tape. He looked at it for a long moment, then back at Elena. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Get her to the secure room," he said to the MPs standing behind him, "and get her a fresh pot of coffee, the good stuff. We're going to be here a long time." Elena walked toward the hangar, the sun at her back. She didn't look back at the desert. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where the ghosts were, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was going to do with them. The door to the hangar closed behind her with a heavy, metallic asterisk clunk asterisk. It was a sound she'd heard 1,000 times before, but today it sounded like a beginning. In the quiet of the secure room, 30 minutes later, Elena sat at a clean desk with a steaming mug of coffee. She opened her notebook to the page marked 88-4. She stared at the number for a long time, then reached for a pen. Below the frequency, she wrote 4 words. Asterisk, they aren't retreating. They're waiting. Asterisk, she closed the notebook and took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, strong, and perfectly bitter. Outside, the base was humming with the sound of 100 engines, 1,000 voices, and the endless, rhythmic pulse of a world at war. Elena Vance closed her eyes and listened to all of it. And then she began to work. The coffee wasn't just strong, it was acidic, the kind of brew that had been sitting in a stainless steel urn for 6 hours until it tasted like a battery terminal. Elena sat in the windowless interrogation room, officially designated as debriefing suite 4, and watched the steam rise in a thin, erratic ribbon. The walls were lined with acoustic foam, gray and oppressive, designed to swallow sound, but to Elena the room was screaming. She could hear the high-frequency whine of the closed-circuit camera in the corner, a 15 kilohertz buzz that sounded like a mosquito trapped in a jar. She could hear the rhythmic clicking of the HVAC system, a 3-beat cycle that told her the bearings in the primary fan assembly were 48 hours away from a catastrophic failure. The door opened, the heavy steel frame groaning on its hinges. Colonel Hendricks walked in, but he wasn't the same man who had greeted her on the tarmac. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by the sterile, practiced neutrality of a career officer about to perform a delicate surgery on the truth. He carried a thin manila folder, not the digital tablet she expected. In the SIF, paper was still king because paper didn't leave a digital footprint. "Staff Sergeant," Hendricks said, sitting across from her. He didn't offer more coffee. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an NDA with a Department of Defense seal that looked heavier than the mountain she'd just climbed. "We've reviewed the data packet you sent from the ridge." Elena didn't move. She kept her hands wrapped around the warm mug, feeling the slight tremor in the ceramic. And there are discrepancies," Hendricks said. He laid a photograph on the table. It was a satellite thermal of the Costi Pass, taken at 0400. "Our birds show the pass was empty. No hydraulic platforms, no mobile missile batteries, no Krasaka units." Elena felt a cold needle of dread settle in her stomach. "I saw them, Colonel. I tracked their resonance for 6 hours. I had a directional antenna locked on their signature. Styx saw the helicopters. He's in your infirmary right now with a hole in his leg to prove it. Corporal Morty is being treated for injuries sustained during a fall," Hendricks said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "His statement indicates that your vehicle was struck by an IED, causing a period of disorientation for both of you. He claims he doesn't remember seeing any unmarked aircraft. He says you were acting erratic." The room seemed to shrink. Elena could hear the colonel's heart rate, a steady, unbothered 72 beats per minute. He wasn't lying because he was a villain. He was lying because he was a professional. He was the institutional wall, the person whose job it was to ensure that the mess of the Gumbad didn't smear the reputation of the 10th Mountain Division or the Pentagon's billion-dollar contracts with Vanguard Tactical. "Styx wouldn't say that," Elena said quietly. "He already did. He signed the statement 10 minutes ago. He's a good soldier, Elena. He knows how the world works. He knows that sometimes a sergeant gets tired. Sometimes the desert makes people hear things that aren't there. "I have the notebook," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "I have the frequencies, 42.8. You can't fake the physics of a hydraulic stabilizer echoing off granite. If you check the seismic logs from the regional monitors. The regional monitors were undergoing a scheduled maintenance cycle. Hendricks interrupted. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Staff Sergeant Vance, you have an exemplary record. Your father was a hero in Lima. You've served this country with a gift that few people understand. But that gift is also a liability. It makes you prone to sensory overstimulation, hypervigilance. The doctors call it signal-induced paranoia. The institutional failure wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow, methodical erasure. They weren't going to court-martial her. They were going to medically discharge her. They were going to tell the world that the woman who heard everything had finally started hearing ghosts. Where is my notebook, Colonel? It's being processed as classified material. It's in a secure locker." Elena leaned back. She didn't argue, she didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes and listened. Beyond the walls of the suite, she could hear the base moving. She heard the distinct, heavy footfalls of an MP walking the corridor. She heard the distant, metallic asterisk clink asterisk of a locker door closing in the evidence room down the hall. But deeper than that, beneath the noise of the base, she heard the frequency again. 88.4. It wasn't coming from the desert. It was coming from inside Bagram. It was a low-frequency pulse, hidden inside the electrical hum of the base's power grid. It was the same signature she'd seen on her spectrum analyzer in the Pave Hawk. A shadow frequency. If she hadn't spent 20 years listening to the hidden languages of machines, she would have missed it. But it was there, a rhythmic, coded data stream being pushed through the base's own wiring. Vanguard wasn't just in the valley. Vanguard was in the walls. "I need to see Corporal Morty," Elena said. "That's not possible. He's being medevaced to Landstuhl for further evaluation." "He has a flesh wound, Colonel." "You don't send a flesh wound to Germany unless you're trying to put 4,000 miles between a witness and a crime scene." Hendricks stood up. The chair screeched against the linoleum, a sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. "You're done, Sergeant. You're being restricted to these quarters until your evaluation is complete. A doctor will be by at 0800 to begin your psych screening. I suggest you use the time to think about your future. You can leave here with a pension and your dignity, or you can leave here in a cage. Those are the only two frequencies on the dial." He walked out, and the heavy thud of the door locking was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. She sat in the silence for a long time. She didn't touch the coffee. She didn't look at the camera. She waited until her ears adjusted to the ambient noise of the room, until she could isolate the sound of the guards breathing outside the door. He was young. His boots were too new, the leather stiff and squeaking with every shift of his weight. Private first class, maybe a corporal. Not a Tier 1 operator, just a kid following orders. Elena stood up and moved to the air vent near the ceiling. She didn't need a ladder. She used the edge of the table to hoist herself up, her movements silent and economical. She pressed her ear to the metal grating. The ductwork of a military base is a natural acoustic waveguide. If you know how to listen, you can hear a conversation 3 floors up. She tuned out the roar of the HVAC and searched for the 88, for signature. She found it, a faint, rhythmic clicking coming from the communications hub in the basement. But she found something else, too. 2 voices, muffled but distinct, echoing through the vents from a room nearby. "Packet didn't go to Bagram, Maine," a man said. His voice was gravelly, the accent thick with the flat vowels of the Pacific Northwest. "It hit the Vanguard relay first." Vance must have used a piezoelectric burst. The mountain itself acted as a transducer. "Can we scrub it?" a second voice asked. This one was smoother, younger, professional. "We're trying." But the signal was caught by a commercial weather satellite owned by a German firm. If they look at the raw data, they'll see the anomaly. "Hendricks is trying to bury the girl, but we need to find that notebook." She's got the harmonic breakdown of the Krasukha units. If that gets out, the contractors are done. The DoD won't be able to protect the deniability of the operation. What about the boy, Morty? He's being handled. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him once the morphine kicks in. But Vance, she's the problem. She doesn't just see the data. She hears it. You can't gaslight someone who can hear the truth. Then we don't gaslight her, the smooth voice said. We neutralize the sensor. The conversation ended with the sound of a door closing. Elena dropped back to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Neutralize the sensor. It wasn't just a military euphemism. To a SIGINT specialist, neutralizing a sensor meant destroying its ability to receive input. They weren't going to kill her. They were going to deafen her, or worse. She looked at the door. She had no weapon, no notebook, no partner. She was a staff sergeant in a locked room on a base that was being hollowed out by a private military corporation, and the only person she could trust was currently being drugged into a stupor 400 yards away. She needed to move. Not because she wanted to save her career, but because she was a soldier and her mission was the truth. She moved to the sink in the corner of the room. It was a standard industrial unit, bolted to the wall. She reached into the pocket of her OCPs and pulled out the rusted screwdriver her father had given her, the one the MPs had somehow missed during her processing, because they were looking for knives and radios, not a tool for a Massey Ferguson tractor. She didn't use it to pry the door. She used it to unscrew the faceplate of the electrical outlet near the floor. The wiring inside was standard 110 volt, but it was connected to the base's local area network, LAN, for the smart building monitoring system. Elena stripped the insulation from two of the wires with her teeth, the metallic taste of copper filling her mouth. She felt the low-level vibration of the 88.4 frequency in the wire. It was a heartbeat. A signal. She wasn't just going to escape the room. She was going to talk back to the mountain. She took her handheld spectrum analyzer, the one Hendricks had confiscated but left on the table during his exit, likely thinking it was a broken toy, and opened the battery compartment. She bypassed the internal limiter and wired the device directly into the LAN. She closed her eyes, her fingers moving with the dark competence of a woman who could see electricity. She wasn't typing code. She was tuning an instrument. She adjusted the frequency of the analyzer until it matched the 88 for resonance. Then she began to tap. Asterisk dot. Dash dot dot. Asterisk. It was Morse code, an ancient language for a modern war. She wasn't sending it to Bagram. She was sending it into the base's power grid using the copper wiring as an antenna. She was sending it to the one person on the base who would be listening for the ghost. Asterisk SDICKS. WAKE. UP. Asterisk. She repeated the signal over and over, her thumb steady on the contact wire. She felt the heat building in the analyzer. The small device never meant to handle this much current. The plastic casing began to smell of ozone and melting solder. Outside the door, the guard shifted. Elena froze. She heard the asterisk click asterisk of a radio being keyed. Tower 1, this is Suite 4. I've got a weird hum coming from the room. Sounds like, I don't know, like a hive of bees. Elena didn't stop. She pressed harder. Asterisk SDICKS. COMMSHCK. 0-4-0-0. Asterisk. The analyzer flared once, a bright orange spark jumping from the battery terminals, and then it went dead. The room returned to its gray, suffocating silence. Elena sat back on her heels, her breath coming in shallow rasps. She had no way of knowing if the signal had reached him. She had no way of knowing if Styx was even conscious. But she had made her decision. The line between authorized and right had been crossed. She was no longer a sergeant following orders. She was a sensor operating in the red. She waited. An hour passed, 2. The base's night cycle took over. The roar of the jet engines outside dimmed to a low growl. The light under the door was the only thing that marked the passage of time. At 0330, the sound of the base changed. It was subtle, a shift in the pressure of the air. A C-17 was spooling up on the flight line, its four massive engines creating an acoustic blanket that covered the entire northern sector of the base. It was the perfect noise floor. Suddenly, the 15 kilohertz whine of the camera in the corner stopped. The small green light on the lens went black. A second later, the heavy steel door clicked. Not the sound of a key, but the sound of an electronic override. The door swung open 6 inches. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't check the hallway. She moved through the gap like a shadow, her boots making no sound on the linoleum. Standing in the hallway was not Styx. It was a woman she didn't recognize, a civilian in a gray jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She held a tablet in one hand and a suppressed Sig Sauer in the other. She looked at Elena with eyes that were as cold and analytical as a thermal scope. "Staff Sergeant Vance," the woman said. Her voice had no accent, no inflection. It was the voice of the machine. "You're making this very difficult for everyone. Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Thorne. I'm the Regional Director for Vanguard Tactical Solutions, and you, Sergeant, are currently in possession of proprietary data that belongs to my shareholders." "I'm in possession of evidence of a war crime," Elena said, her voice steady. Thorne tilted her head. "A war crime? No, we're in the business of stabilization. The Gumbad incident was a field test. A demonstration of electronic sovereignty. We aren't the enemy, Elena. We're the future of the American military. We provide the silence that allows the noise to happen. But you found the note we weren't ready to play yet." Thorne raised the Sig Sauer. She didn't aim for Elena's head. She aimed for her shoulder. "You're going to come with me? We're going to Landstuhl, just like your friend. And by the time you wake up, the Gumbad will be a story about an IED and a tired sergeant." Elena looked at the woman, and then she looked at the walls. She heard it again, not the 88, something else. A low, rhythmic asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk coming from the ceiling. It was the sound of a heart. But it wasn't human. "You should have listened to the ductwork," Elena said. Before Thorne could pull the trigger, the acoustic ceiling tiles above her head exploded. A massive tan shape blurred through the air, hitting Thorne with the force of a high-speed collision. It was a Belgian Malinois, a MWD military working dog named Buster, the one who usually sat outside the comms shack and watched the horizon with Elena. And behind Buster, dropping through the gap in the ceiling with a grimace of pure agony, was Styx. He landed hard, his bandaged leg buckling under him, but he had a suppressed MP5 in his hands. He didn't fire. He just leveled the barrel at Thorne's chest. "Sarge," Styx wheezed, his face white with pain. "Tell me we're leaving, because I'm pretty sure I just broke every bone in my foot." Buster stood over Thorne, his teeth inches from her throat, a low, guttural snarl vibrating in his chest. Thorne didn't move. She knew the physics of a Malinois. Elena stepped over to Styx, her hands moving to support him. She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask how he got there. She just looked at him, and for a split second the controlled mask slipped, and he saw the raw, terrifying loyalty that lived behind her eyes. "The comms shack," Elena said. "They've got guards on it, Sarge. Half of Bagram is looking for us." "They're looking for 2 people on the ground," Elena said. "They aren't looking for the signal." She reached down and took the tablet from Thorne's limp hand. She didn't look at the files, she looked at the hardware. It was a Tier 1 Vanguard uplink connected directly to the 88-4 relay. It was the key to the entire house. "Styx, can you walk?" "I can crawl if I have to. Buster's got my back." They moved through the maintenance tunnels, a labyrinth of steam pipes and electrical conduits that ran like veins beneath the base. Elena led the way, not because she knew the map, but because she followed the sound of the power. She could hear the base's servers humming, the massive data flow of a global military operation passing through the wires around them. To the rest of the world, Bagram was a fortress of steel and concrete. To Elena, it was a hollow shell, a drum that she was about to beat until it cracked. They reached the base of the communications tower at 0350. The tower rose 300 feet into the desert sky. A skeletal finger pointed at the stars. It was the highest point on the base, the place where all the signals of the 10th mountain were gathered and hurled into space. "We can't go up there," Styx whispered, leaning against a concrete pylon. "They'll see us on the thermal." "They won't see us if the thermal is looking at something else," Elena said. She took the Vanguard tablet and the rusted screwdriver. She didn't look for a keypad. She looked for the grounding wire of the tower. It was a thick, braided copper cable that ran into the earth. "Styx, I need you to key your radio to the base-wide emergency frequency. Don't transmit, just hold the button." "Sarge, that'll trigger the alert." "Exactly." Elena knelt by the grounding cable. She wasn't an analyst anymore. She was a mechanic. She was her father's daughter, sitting in a garage in Ohio, learning that every machine has a breaking point. She pressed the tablet against the copper cable. She used the screwdriver to bridge the connection between the tablet's high-output battery and the tower's lightning arrestor. It was a suicide move for the hardware. "Now," she said. Styx hit the key. Elena jammed the screwdriver into the circuit. A massive, invisible surge of electromagnetic energy erupted from the tablet, channeled directly into the tower's skeletal frame. It wasn't an EMP that killed everything. It was a harmonic scream. Every radio on Bagram suddenly erupted with a sound that was neither static nor speech. It was the sound of the Gumbad Valley, the 42, 8 resonance amplified 1,000,000 times over. The guards at the gate dropped their headsets, clutching their ears. The thermal cameras on the perimeter flared white, blinded by the sudden surge of infrared heat radiating from the tower. In the chaos, Elena and Styx moved. They didn't go up the tower. They went to the motor pool. Elena didn't look for a Humvee. She looked for the shop truck, the battered LMTV she'd used to escape to the ridge. It was sitting in the corner, forgotten, its engine block still warm from the long drive back. She climbed into the driver's seat. Styx collapsed into the passenger side, Buster jumping in behind him. "Where are we going, Sarge? We can't get through the gate. They've got the whole base on lockdown." "We aren't going through the gate," Elena said. She started the engine. The LMTV roared to life, a deep, rhythmic thrum that Elena felt in her marrow. She didn't look at the road. She looked at the ghost note on the spectrum analyzer, which was still twitching in her hand. The 88.4 signal was getting louder. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from a convoy of unmarked black SUVs that was currently racing toward the flight line. "Miller isn't the only one," Elena said, her voice cold. "The Vanguard director was here to pick up the data. They're taking it to a private hangar on the civilian side of the field. If that plane takes off, the evidence is gone." "Sarge, that's the civilian side," Styx said, his eyes wide. "If we cross the line, the MPs will have authorization to use lethal force. We'll be enemy combatants." Elena shifted the LMTV into gear. She looked at Styx, and for the first time since the ridge, she let him see the fear. Not the fear of dying, the fear of failing the mission. "They already decided what we are, Styx. I'm just giving them the frequency to match the role." She slammed the LMTV into gear and floored the accelerator. The heavy truck lurched forward, smashing through the chain-link fence that separated the military sector from the civilian airfield. The sound of tearing metal was a high-pitched shriek that Elena leaned into, a jagged note in the symphony of the night. Behind them, the sirens of Bagram began to wail, a 3-tone rhythmic pulse that Elena knew was the security breach alarm. "Hold on," she shouted over the roar of the wind. The LMTV raced across the open tarmac, the headlights cutting through the dark. Ahead, she saw the black SUVs. They were flanking a sleek, unmarked Gulfstream jet that was already beginning its taxi. Elena didn't slow down. She steered the truck directly into the path of the lead SUV. "Sarge," Styx yelled. "Listen to the weight, Styx." Elena cried. "Feel the momentum." She didn't hit them. At the last second, she swerved, the LMTV massive tires screaming as she drifted the 10-ton truck in a wide arc, the back end swinging out like a wrecking ball. The rear of the truck smashed into the SUV's engine block, sending the smaller vehicle spinning across the tarmac in a shower of sparks and shattered glass. Elena slammed on the brakes, the LMTV skidding to a halt 20 yards from the Gulfstream. The jet stopped. Its engines were still whining, a 20 kilohertz scream that Elena felt in her teeth. She jumped out of the truck, the spectrum analyzer in one hand and the screwdriver in the other. She didn't have a gun, she didn't need one. "Sticks, cover the door!" Sticks hobbled out, his MP5 leveled at the Gulfstream's cabin. Buster was a blur of tan fur circling the jet, his bark a rhythmic boom that echoed off the hangar walls. The door of the Gulfstream opened. Colonel Hendricks stepped out. He wasn't wearing his dress uniform anymore. He was wearing a tactical jacket, his face a mask of cold, concentrated rage. He held a tablet in one hand, the real notebook, the digital original of Elena's data. "You should have stayed in the room, Elena," Hendricks said. He didn't raise a weapon, he didn't have to. Behind him, 4 Vanguard contractors stepped onto the air stair, their rifles aimed at Elena's chest. "The signal is still live, Colonel," Elena said. She held up the spectrum analyzer. "I didn't just blind the base. I turned the communications tower into a wideband recorder. Everything you've said for the last hour, everything Thorne said in the tunnel, it's being broadcast on every emergency frequency from here to Kabul." Hendricks paused. For the first time, his heart rate spiked. Elena could hear it, a frantic, irregular asterisk, thud, thud, thud asterisk. "You're lying," he said. "The tower doesn't have that capacity." "The tower doesn't," Elena said, stepping forward into the light of the jet's landing gear. "But the mountain does. I didn't just hit a bell, Colonel. I woke up the whole range." The quartz veins in the gumbat are still ringing. They're acting as a natural buffer. You can't delete a signal that's stored in the earth. It was a bluff, a beautiful technical hallucination, but Hendricks didn't know that. He only knew that Elena Vance saw things he couldn't see and heard things he couldn't hear. "Give me the tablet," Elena said. "And if I don't, then the next sound you hear won't be my voice. It'll be the sound of a pair of A-10s coming to see who's jamming the regional air traffic control." Hendricks looked at the horizon. He looked at the base, where the lights were still flickering, where the sirens were still screaming. He looked at the woman standing in the middle of the tarmac, a mechanic with a rusted screwdriver and a gift that was currently tearing his world apart. He looked at the tablet. Then, slowly, he reached back and handed it to one of the contractors. "Kill her," he said, "and get that plane in the air." The lead contractor leveled his rifle. But before he could pull the trigger, the 88, 4 frequency, the shadow that Elena had been tracking, didn't just pulse. It asterisk shifted asterisk. The ground beneath the Gulfstream suddenly erupted in a geyser of sand and concrete. A massive subsurface explosion tore through the tarmac, the force of it throwing the jet onto its side like a toy. Elena was thrown backward, the world turning into a roar of fire and dust. As she struggled to her feet, her ears ringing with a deafening 100-decibel white noise, she looked toward the crater. It wasn't an IED. It wasn't an airstrike. Rising from the hole in the tarmac was something she hadn't seen in any manual. It was a mechanical bore, a massive hydraulic drill head covered in the same thermal blankets she'd seen in the valley. And behind it, emerging from the dark earth of the base itself, were the real ghosts. The insurgents weren't coming from across the border. They were already under the base. The 88, 4 frequency wasn't a communication. It was a countdown. Elena looked at Styx, who was pinned under a piece of the LMTV wreckage. She looked at Hendricks, who was staring at the hole in the ground with a look of absolute, soul-shattering realization. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about an invasion that was already happening beneath their feet. Elena reached for her screwdriver, her fingers finding the cold, rusted metal in the dirt. She looked at the drill head, at the rhythmic pulsing of the hydraulic stabilizers that she had heard weeks ago in the gumbad. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She closed her eyes and listened. The mountain was no longer ringing. The base was no longer screaming. The only sound left was the sound of the earth opening up. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance realized that the silence she had been looking for wasn't a sanctuary. It was the moment right before the world ended. She looked at the spectrum analyzer. The needle wasn't twitching anymore. It was pinned to the right. "Styx," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the rising machine. "Don't stop listening." The drill head turned, the massive diamond-tipped teeth catching the first light of the Afghan dawn, and as the first of the black-clad figures emerged from the darkness of the pit, Elena Vance stood her ground, the only woman who knew the frequency of the end, and the only one brave enough to try and change the tune. The shockwave didn't just hit Elena. It rearranged the molecules of the air she was breathing, turning the oxygen into a thick, metallic soup that tasted like burnt copper and pulverized limestone. She was airborne for a heartbeat, a detached observer of her own body being flung across the tarmac like a discarded shell casing, before the world slammed back into her in the form of cold, unyielding concrete. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs in a jagged sob, but it was the sound that followed that truly broke the world. It wasn't the roar of the explosion. That was a blunt instrument. It was the frequency that came after, a 200-decibel shriek of tortured metal and high-pressure hydraulics that sounded like the earth itself was being flayed alive. Elena rolled onto her stomach, her vision swimming in a sea of red and gray, and vomited a mixture of bitter coffee and bile onto the runway. Her ears were bleeding. She could feel the warm, viscous trickle of it mapping the curve of her jaw, but she didn't stop listening. She couldn't. Even in the chaos, her mind was already isolating the notes. The 88. 4 megahertz beacon had gone terminal, turning into a continuous flatline pulse that was slaving every electronic system in the vicinity to its rhythm. Across the tarmac, the Gulf Stream was a broken bird, its wings snapped like a dry twig, the jet fuel beginning to pool in iridescent ripples beneath the fuselage. Hendricks was gone, swallowed by the cloud of dust and debris, but the Vanguard contractors were still there, or what was left of them. They weren't looking at Elena anymore. They were looking at the hole. The mechanical bore, a massive, rotating turret of diamond-tipped teeth and heat-shielded plating, was still spinning, the friction creating a localized heat shimmer that made the air look like it was melting. And then the first figure emerged from the pit. It wasn't an insurgent in a shawl with an AK-47. It was a silhouette in matte black liquid armor, a ghost whose very existence was a violation of every treaty signed since the Cold War. The figure didn't move like a human. It moved with the jerky, terrifying efficiency of a machine-assisted exoskeleton, its movements guided by the same frequency Elena had been tracking. The electronic sovereignty Vanguard had promised wasn't a shield. It was an invitation. Elena forced herself up, her knees buckling, her fingers clawing at the grit-covered concrete. She looked toward the LMTV. The truck was a wreck, its front end crumpled against the black SUV, but Styx was still there. She could see him through the shattered windshield, his face a mask of blood and dust, his hands still gripped around the MP5. Buster was standing over him, the dog's hackles raised, his low growl lost in the mechanical scream of the boar. The dog looked at Elena, and for a split second the sensory overload vanished. There was only the mission. The contractors on the air stairs were starting to fire, their suppressed rounds making a rhythmic asterisk, thud-thud-thud asterisk that Elena's brain immediately translated into a vector map. They were firing at the pit. They were firing at their own creation. Styx! Elena screamed, but the word was a ghost in her own throat. She couldn't hear herself. She could only hear the harmonics. She scrambled toward the LMTV, her hands searching for anything she could use. The spectrum analyzer was gone, crushed in the blast, but she still had the screwdriver, the rusted 4-inch piece of Ohio steel that her father had used to fix tractors. It felt heavy in her hand, a physical anchor in a world that had gone digital. She reached the side of the truck just as a second ghost vaulted out of the pit, its shoulder-mounted sensor array scanning the tarmac with a ruby-red laser that cut through the dust like a knife. The laser passed over Elena and the world slowed down. This was the moment of dark competence, the narrowing of the universe into a series of interconnected systems. She didn't see a monster, she saw a mobile signal relay. The exoskeleton wasn't just armor, it was an antenna. Every movement the ghost made was being fed through a localized mesh network, the same network that was being powered by the 88, 4 frequency. If she could disrupt the relay, she could paralyze the machine. But she needed a source. She needed a way to talk back to the ghost in a language it couldn't ignore. She dived into the cab of the LMTV, pulling Stick's limp body away from the steering wheel. He was conscious, but his eyes were glazed, the pupils blown wide from the concussion. "Sarge," he wheezed, the sound of it vibrating through her palm as she pressed it against his chest. "Sarge, they're in the floor. I know, Sticks, I've got you, stay low. Buster's hit." Elena looked down. The Malinois was shivering, a dark stain spreading across his tan flank where a piece of shrapnel had carved a furrow. He wasn't crying. He was watching the pit with a terrifying, silent focus. Elena felt a surge of rage, cold and precise, a white-hot needle in the center of her chest. This was the cost. This was what loyalty looked like when the institution turned into a ghost. They had used these men, these animals, as sensors, as expendable components in a machine they didn't even understand. She reached under the dashboard of the LMTV and ripped the wiring harness free. She didn't need a spectrum analyzer anymore. She was the analyzer. She took the lead wires from the truck's long-range radio, the powerful sinkers unit that was designed to punch through the Afghan mountains, and stripped the insulation with her teeth. The copper tasted like lightning. She looked at the screwdriver, then at the radio's power amplifier. She was going to create a feedback loop, using the LMTV alternator to pump a raw, unmodulated signal into the mesh network. It was a suicide move for the electronics, and quite possibly for her own nervous system. "Sticks, I need the battery from your radio," she commanded, her voice dropping into that low, controlled register that brooked no argument. Sticks fumbled with his vest, his movements slow and agonizing, and handed her the brick-sized lithium-ion battery. Elena wired it directly into the sinker's amplifier, the screwdriver acting as a bridge. She could feel the heat beginning to radiate from the metal, the smell of ozone and melting plastic filling the cab. She was building a scream box. It wouldn't kill the ghosts, but it would deafen them. It would turn their own hypersensitivity into a weapon. Outside, the battle had turned into a slaughter. The Vanguard contractors were being systematically dismantled by the two ghosts. The machines didn't use bullets. They used high-pressure acoustic pulses that shattered bone and liquefied organs. Elena watched as a man she had seen in the mess hall just 2 days ago was hit by a pulse, his body folding in on itself like a crushed soda can. There was no blood, just the sickening crunch of a structural failure. Hendricks was nowhere to be seen. He had likely crawled into the wreckage of the Gulf Stream, a coward hiding in the carcass of his own ambition. Elena stood up in the cab, the scream box humming in her hands. The vibration was so intense it was making her teeth ache, the 88, 4 frequency vibrating in sympathy with the homemade device. She looked at the two ghosts. They were moving toward the LMTV now, their sensors locked onto the massive electromagnetic signature she was putting out. They saw the signal. They didn't see the woman. "Now," she whispered. She jammed the screwdriver into the final contact. The world didn't explode, it imploded. A wall of invisible pressure erupted from the LMTV, a localized electromagnetic pulse that was perfectly tuned to the 88, 4 harmonic. Elena felt it in her marrow, a sensation like 1,000 needles being driven into her skin at once. Her vision went white. Her heart skipped a beat, then 2, as the current tried to rewrite her own internal rhythm. She didn't let go. She gripped the screwdriver with both hands, her muscles locked in a tetanic spasm, her scream lost in the electronic howl of the scream box. The two ghosts froze. Their shoulder-mounted sensors began to spin wildly, the ruby lasers tracing erratic, nonsensical patterns in the dust. The matte black armor began to vibrate, the hydraulic fluid inside the exoskeletons boiling under the pressure of the feedback loop. One of the machines took a step forward, its legs snapping at the knee joint as the servos fought against the corrupted data. It collapsed into the dirt, a heap of expensive, useless metal. The second ghost turned toward the pit, its brain trying to reconnect with the primary relay beneath the earth, but the scream box was too loud. It was a wall of noise that the machine couldn't climb. Elena's hands were smoking. The plastic of the radio was melting onto her palms, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the ozone, but she didn't stop. She pushed the signal harder, her mind reaching out into the invisible world, feeling the 88. Frequency begin to fracture. She could hear the bore below the ground, the primary tunneling machine, begin to stutter. Its rhythmic asterisk thump 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 asterisk was losing its timing. It was a heart attack in the earth. "Sarge, drop it, you're gonna fry." Styx was screaming now, his voice finally breaking through the static. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the device, but Elena was a statue. She was the transducer. She was the only thing standing between the base and the shadows. With a final, catastrophic asterisk crack asterisk, the scream box detonated. The lithium battery vented in a fountain of white-hot sparks, and the LMTV radio exploded in a shower of glass and metal. Elena was thrown back against the seats, her hands charred and useless, her ears finally, mercifully, falling into a deep, echoing silence. The silence wasn't a lack of sound. It was the quality of a world that had been emptied. Elena lay in the cab, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She couldn't hear the sirens. She couldn't hear the fire. She could only hear the slow, steady beat of her own heart and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal around her. She forced her eyes to move. Outside the LMTV, the two ghosts were dead. They lay in the dirt like discarded toys, their armor cooling, their sensors dark. The pit was silent. The bore had stopped. The invasion had been neutralized at the source, not by a battalion of soldiers, but by a woman who knew how to find the wrong note in a perfect song. "Sarge!" Styx was leaning over her, his face a blur of red and white. He was saying something, but she couldn't make out the words. She looked at his lips, trying to read the movement, but her brain was too tired to translate. She reached up with one of her blackened hands and touched his cheek. His skin was warm. He was real. That was all that mattered. Buster was there too, his head resting on the edge of the seat, his tail giving a single weak wag. He was alive. The cost had been high, but they were still standing. Elena looked toward the Gulf Stream. The door was open. Hendricks was standing on the tarmac, his uniform tattered, his face a mask of disbelief. He was looking at the dead ghosts, then at the LMTV, then at Elena. He didn't look like a colonel anymore. He looked like a man who had seen the god of the machines die and realized he was next. Elena didn't feel rage anymore. She didn't feel triumph. She only felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had done the mission. She had protected the truth. And now the world was going to come for her. She knew how the military worked. They wouldn't thank her for saving Bagram with a screwdriver and a radio. They would court-martial her for destroying proprietary equipment. They would bury her in a different kind of silence, one made of NDAs and medical discharges. She didn't care. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. As she drifted off, she felt the first light of the sun hitting her face. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. Time didn't have a frequency anymore. There was only the light and the silence and the knowledge that for one brief, terrifying moment, she had been the loudest thing in the world. The immediate aftermath was a blur of high-intensity lights and the taste of industrial-grade oxygen. Elena felt herself being lifted, the stretcher beneath her hard and narrow, the voices of the medics sounding like they were underwater. They were shouting, standard military trauma protocols, but she just watched the sky. The Afghan dawn was a bruised purple, the stars fading into the encroaching blue. She could see the silhouette of the communication tower, the skeletal frame still standing against the horizon, its grounding wire probably still glowing from the surge she'd sent through it. They moved her toward the medevac pad. The smell of JP-8 was everywhere, thick and nauseating, the lifeblood of a base that was finally waking up to its own near destruction. She saw the MPs first, a wall of desert camo and black Kevlar, their faces set in the grim, unblinking masks of men who had been told they were under attack and didn't know who the enemy was. They weren't looking at her with respect. They were looking at her as a variable, a breach. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vance?" A voice boomed closer this time. She turned her head slowly. It was a major she didn't recognize, his uniform crisp despite the hour, his eyes hidden behind dark ballistic glasses. He held a digital tablet, not a Vanguard one, but a standard DoD issue. Behind him, she could see a team of men in plainclothes tactical gear, Tier 1, probably Delta or SAD. They were already securing the pit, their movements surgical and cold. They weren't there to help the wounded, they were there to sanitize the site. "Can you hear me, Sergeant?" the major asked, leaning over her. Elena didn't answer, she couldn't. Her vocal cords felt like they'd been scrubbed with sandpaper, and the silence in her ears was absolute, a thick white noise that felt like physical pressure. She just stared at him, her eyes steady, her jaw set. She didn't beg for water, she didn't ask about sticks, she just existed. "She's non-responsive," the major said, turning to someone out of view. "Get her to the secure ward. Nobody talks to her. Nobody gets near her without a TSI clearance and a direct order from CENTCOM, and find that dog. If it's still alive, I want it in a kennel under 24-hour guard." Elena felt a spark of that controlled rage return. Asterisk Buster. Asterisk she tried to sit up, her charred hands clawing at the straps of the stretcher, but the medics pushed her back down. A needle found the vein in her arm, cold, fast-acting sedative, and the purple sky began to swirl into a deep velvet black. She woke up in a room that smelled of antiseptic and ozone. It was small, windowless, the walls made of reinforced concrete that had been painted a sterile, institutional cream. There was a clock on the wall, the second hand moving in a rhythmic, silent sweep. Elena looked at it for a long time, her mind automatically trying to assign a frequency to its movement. 50 hertz, the hum of the fluorescent lights. 60 hertz, the vibration of the specialized medical monitors. 8 hertz, the low-frequency thrum of the base's backup generators. She was in the SIF, the secure incremental compartmented facility, the infirmary for people who knew too much. Her hands were wrapped in thick white bandages, the pain a dull, throbbing ache that was being kept at bay by a steady drip of morphine. Her ears were still ringing, but she could hear now, a muffled, distorted version of the world like she was listening through a thick layer of wool. The door opened. It wasn't a doctor. It was Hendricks. He looked older. The crispness was gone from his uniform, replaced by a weary, haunted look that reached deep into his eyes. He sat in the plastic chair by her bed and didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her hands. "The notebook was encrypted," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. "Even after you handed it to me, my team couldn't get past the third layer of the Vanguard firmware. But the broadcast you sent, the scream from the tower, it wasn't just noise, Elena." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was a key. You used the 42/8 resonance to trigger a backdoor in the Vanguard encryption. By the time the signal reached Kabul, every intel agency in the region had a raw, unencrypted data stream of Vanguard's internal sovereignty protocols. You didn't just stop the bore, you burned the entire program." Elena looked at him, her expression unchanging. "Good," she croaked, the word tearing at her throat. "It's not good, Sergeant, it's a catastrophe. You've compromised a multi-billion-dollar defense contract. You've exposed classified DARPA research into subsurface tactical insertion. You've made us look like we lost control of our own backyard." "We did," Elena said. Hendricks stood up, his face hardening. "The report is being written now. It'll say that the Gumbad incident was a seismic event caused by illegal mining operations. It'll say the breach at Bagram was a localized gas explosion. And it'll say that you, Staff Sergeant Vance, suffered a psychotic break during the crisis and had to be neutralized for your own safety." He looked at her, and for a second she saw a flicker of something that might have been regret, or maybe it was just fear. "You're going home, Elena. Not as a hero, as a patient. You'll have a pension, a quiet house in Ohio, and a permanent gag order. If you ever speak a word of what happened, to a journalist, to a lawyer, to your own father, you'll disappear into a hole that even you can't hear your way out of." He turned to leave, but he stopped at the door. "Morty is being discharged. He's going back to Montana. He's taking the dog with him. He won't be talking either. He's a good soldier. He knows how to keep his head down." The door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the small room like a gunshot. Elena lay back on the pillows. She felt the weight of the silence, the crushing pressure of the institution she had served so faithfully. They were erasing her. They were taking her gift, her sacrifice, her very identity, and turning it into a psychotic break. It was the ultimate cost, not her hands, not her hearing, but her truth. She looked at the clock again. The second hand was still moving. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, moving past the morphine, past the bandages, past the cream-colored walls. She listened to the bass. She listened to the rumble of the C-17s taking off for Landstuhl. She listened to the clatter of the mess hall. She listened to the distant, rhythmic clicking of the HVAC system, the one she'd predicted would fail in 48 hours. And then she heard it. It was faint, so faint it was almost an imagination. A low, rhythmic asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk coming from deep within the earth. It wasn't 88, 4. It wasn't the bore. It was a heartbeat, not the heart of a machine, the heart of the mountain. The gumbad was still ringing. The quartz veins, the granite peaks, the ancient tectonic bones of the earth, they had recorded the song she had played. They were holding it, a seismic echo that would last for 1,000 years. They could take her rank. They could take her voice. They could even take her name, but they couldn't take the sound. Elena Vance smiled, a small, jagged movement of her lips that felt like a victory. She wasn't a sergeant anymore. She wasn't a censor. She was a ghost, a part of the frequency that would never be silenced. She waited for the sleep to take her again, her mind already beginning to map the new silence, finding the hidden notes, the secret languages, the truth that lived in the gaps between the noise. She was right. She had always been right. And in a world that punished the truth, that was the only commendation that mattered. The next few hours were a clinical exercise in erasure. Men in suits who didn't introduce themselves came in and out of the room, their faces as interchangeable as their questions. They didn't care about the ghosts in the pit. They cared about the data stream. They wanted to know how she'd bypassed the Vanguard firmware. They wanted to know what she'd seen in the gumbad. Elena gave them nothing. She sat in the bed, her bandaged hands resting on the thin white sheet, her eyes fixed on a point 3 inches above their heads. She had entered the red, the state of total sensory control where the external world was just a series of inputs to be ignored. One of them, a younger man with the sharp, predatory eyes of an intelligence analyst, leaned in close to her ear. "We know about the screwdriver, Sergeant. We know about the sinker's override. It's impressive. But it's also proof of a premeditated intent to sabotage government property. We could send you to Leavenworth for 20 years just for the radio you fried." Elena didn't blink. She just listened to his pulse. It was fast, 95 beats per minute. He was nervous. He was bluffing. They didn't want a trial. A trial meant discovery. A trial meant a public record. They wanted her to disappear quietly, a victim of her own mind. "The dog is in the truck," Elena said, her voice a dry rattle. It was the first time she'd spoken in hours. The analyst paused. "What? The dog? Buster. He's in the truck with Corporal Morty. If you touch him, if you even think about interfering with his transport, I'll tell the next person who walks through that door exactly what 88, 4 means. And I'll tell them who authorized the test in the gumbad." The analyst looked at his colleagues. There was a moment of pure, unadulterated tension, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight. Elena held his gaze, her eyes like twin chips of flint. She wasn't begging. She was making a tactical trade. "The corporal and the animal are already on their way to the flight line," the analyst said finally, his voice cold. "They're not part of this conversation. You are." "Then we're done," Elena said. She closed her eyes, effectively ending the interview. She heard them leave, their footsteps heavy with frustration, the door slamming with a satisfying, metallic asterisk thud asterisk. An hour later, the nurses came. They were different from the ones who had treated her before, older, more efficient, their eyes carefully averted. They prepped her for transport, wrapping her in a heavy, weighted blanket and placing noise-canceling headphones over her ears. They didn't tell her where she was going, but she knew the vibration of the C-130 when she felt it through the tarmac. She was leaving Bagram. She was leaving the war. The flight was a long, vibrating tunnel of gray noise. Elena spent the time focused on her breath, the rhythmic asterisk in and out asterisk of her lungs, the only anchor she had left. She felt the pressure changes as they climbed, the cold of the high-altitude air seeping through the fuselage. She thought about the ridge. She thought about the sound of the wind through the antenna, the way the desert had looked in the moonlight, silver and vast and full of secrets. She thought about the man who had looked her in the eye and told her she was hearing ghosts, and she realized that she was the only one who had ever truly seen the mountain. They landed at Ramstein in Germany, but she didn't see the base. She was moved from the plane to an unmarked van, then to a secure medical facility that felt more like a prison than a hospital. The rooms were padded, the lights dim, the air perfectly filtered. There were no machines here. No radios, no signals. They were trying to starve her of input. They were trying to break the sensor by giving it nothing to sense. It didn't work. Elena sat in the center of the room, her back against the wall, her legs crossed. She didn't need the external world. She had the memory of the frequency. She could still hear the 42, 8 resonance, the deep, tectonic heartbeat of the Gumbad. She could still hear the ghost note, the one she'd found in the basement of Bagram. She began to hum, a low, barely audible sound that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a song. It was a mathematical progression, a code. Day after day, she sat in the silence, her mind working, her body healing. The bandages came off her hands, leaving behind a network of jagged, silver scars that looked like a topographic map. Her hearing returned, but it was different now, more acute, more selective. She could hear the blood rushing through her own veins. She could hear the hum of the security cameras in the hallway. She could hear the way the air shifted when someone was standing outside her door. She was waiting. One morning the door opened, and a woman she had never seen before walked in. She was older, with gray hair cut into a sharp bob and a suit that cost more than Elena had made in 10 years of service. She didn't carry a tablet or a folder. She just carried a cup of coffee. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Elena. "My name is Director Vance," she said. "No relation, just a name. I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence. And I'm the person who has to decide what to do with you." Elena didn't say anything. She just watched the steam rising from the coffee cup. "Colonel Hendricks is being retired," the director said. "General Miller is being reassigned to a desk in the Pentagon where he'll spend the rest of his career counting paperclips. Vanguard Tactical has had its contract suspended pending a full congressional inquiry." "You did a lot of damage, Elena." "The truth usually does," Elena said. "The truth is a luxury we can't always afford," the director countered. "But you're a different kind of problem. You're a sensor that we can't calibrate. You saw a threat that our billion-dollar satellite arrays missed. You heard an invasion that was happening 300 feet under your boots." She leaned in, her voice dropping. "We can't have you in the field anymore. You're too compromised, too known, and quite frankly, you're too dangerous. But we also can't afford to let you go back to Ohio and spend the rest of your life staring at the walls." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pin, the insignia of a signal intelligence specialist, but with a black bar across the center. "There's a facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It doesn't exist on any map. It's where we send the things we can't explain, the signals we can't decode, the ghosts we can't catch. I want you to go there, Elena. I want you to listen, not to the war, to the world." Elena looked at the pin. She felt the weight of it, the gravity of a new kind of service. It wasn't a medal, it wasn't a promotion. It was a life in the shadows, a permanent exile from the world she knew. "And Styx?" she asked. "Corporal Morty is in Montana. He's training search and rescue dogs for the Forest Service. He's happy, and he's safe. That was part of the deal, wasn't it?" Elena looked at the woman, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something like hope. Not the hope of a hero's return, the hope of a mission that finally matched her capability. "I have one condition," Elena said. "What?" "I want the notebook, the real one." The one Hendricks tried to burn. The director smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, but it was an honest one. "It's already waiting for you in the Blue Ridge, Sergeant, along with a brand new spectrum analyzer, one that can handle a bit more than 110 volts. Elena stood up. Her body was stiff, her hands were scarred, and her ears were still ringing with the ghost of the Gumbad. But as she walked out of the room, she didn't look back. She didn't think about the cost. She didn't think about the betrayal. She just listened. The hallway was full of sounds. The hum of the lights, the breath of the guards, the distant, rhythmic clicking of a clock. To anyone else, it was just noise. To Elena Vance, it was a language. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to talk back. As she stepped out of the facility and into the crisp, cool air of the German morning, she felt the vibration of the earth beneath her boots. It was a low-frequency pulse, steady and deep, the heartbeat of a planet that never stopped moving. The war was over, but the signal was just beginning. Elena looked up at the sky, the vast, blue expanse of a world that was still full of secrets. She took a breath, the air tasting of pine and cold stone, and for a single, perfect moment, everything was in tune. She was Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, a SIGINT specialist, a sensor, a ghost, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She turned toward the waiting van, her pace steady, her head up. She didn't need a medal. She didn't need a parade. She had the silence and the truth and the knowledge that as long as she was listening, the shadows would never have the last word. The door of the van closed with a heavy, final asterisk thud asterisk, and as it pulled away from the facility, Elena closed her eyes and let the frequencies wash over her. 42, 8, 88, 4. 15, 0. They were all there, woven into the fabric of the world, a symphony of the hidden and the unseen. And in the center of it all, quiet and strong and perfectly calibrated, was the heart of the woman who had heard it all. The road ahead was long, and the mountains were waiting. Elena Vance leaned back into the seat, a small, knowing smile on her lips, and began to map the song of the future. The reckoning was over. The listening had only just begun. The facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains did not have a name, at least not one that appeared on any manifest or GPS coordinate. To the few locals in the nearby town of Sugar Grove, it was just another government annex, a place where the power lines were a little thicker and the fences a little higher than they needed to be. To Elena, as the black SUV climbed the winding, gravel-choked access road, it felt like a burial ground. The air here was different from the dry, metallic heat of Bagram. It was damp and heavy with the scent of pine needle decay and wet slate. It was a lush, green silence that felt more oppressive than the desert ever had. She sat in the back seat, her bandaged hands resting like two white stones in her lap, watching the rhythmic flash of the trees passing by. She didn't look at the driver, a man in a charcoal suit whose pulse was a steady, boring 62 beats per minute. She didn't look at the specialized medical monitors bolted to the back of the front seat. She just listened to the tires on the gravel, a low-frequency grinding that her mind automatically began to break down into its component harmonics. The transition from staff sergeant to special guest had happened with a surgical coldness that only the United States military could achieve. There had been no paperwork for her to sign, no exit interview, no final salute. Her uniform had been taken in Germany, bagged and tagged as biohazardous material because of the lithium dust and hydraulic fluid. In its place, they had given her civilian clothes, a gray fleece, black tactical pants, and boots that didn't have the worn-in comfort of her old-issued set. She felt like an imposter in her own skin. The station, as she would come to call it, was a brutalist slab of concrete tucked into a natural amphitheater of granite. It didn't look like a laboratory or a military base. It looked like a tomb for secrets. When the SUV finally hissed to a stop in the underground garage, the silence that rushed in was absolute. It was the kind of silence that had been engineered, a vacuum of sound that made the pressure in Elena's ears spike with a sharp, familiar pain. The first few weeks were not spent listening to the world. They were spent in a windowless room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and industrial-grade air filters. The institution's response to what Elena had done was not a court-martial, nor was it a commendation. It was an interrogation disguised as medical care. Every morning at 06:00, a team of 4 specialists, none of whom wore a uniform, though their posture shouted "Officer," would enter her room. They didn't ask her about the ghosts or the hole in the runway. They asked her about the frequency. They wanted to know the exact moment she had perceived the shift in the 88, 4 megahertz band. They wanted to know why her brain had processed the sinker's feedback loop as a weapon instead of noise. They were trying to reverse engineer a human being, treating her like a piece of salvaged hardware that had performed outside its design parameters. The personal cost arrived in the quiet moments between these sessions, when the doctors would unwrap her hands. The skin was a landscape of pink and silver, the nerves raw and screaming at the slightest touch of the air. The occupational therapist, a woman named Sarah who never smiled, would force Elena to pick up small wooden pegs and move them from one bowl to another. It was a humiliation that Elena endured with a terrifying, frozen discipline. She would stare at her trembling fingers. Her teeth gritted so hard her jaw ached, and she would move the pegs. One by one, asterisk click, click, click. Asterisk the sound of the wood hitting the bowl was the only victory she had. She had spent a decade becoming the finest censor in the theater, a woman who could hear a secondary detonator being wired 3 miles away, and now she was struggling to grasp a piece of cedar. The institution was a machine, and the machine was busy protecting itself. While Elena was being calibrated in the Blue Ridge, the fallout from the Gumbad incident was being managed with a ruthless efficiency. In Washington, D.C., the narrative was being rewritten in real time. The Vanguard contracts weren't being canceled because of a catastrophic failure or a hidden invasion. They were being restructured due to budgetary shifts. The technology Elena had seen, the matte black liquid armor, the acoustic pulse weapons, was being scrubbed from the record, moved into the black budget where it could be buried even deeper. The men she had saved didn't exist in the official report. The ghosts she had killed were classified as unidentified debris from an underground seismic event. The machine didn't want justice, it wanted a clean ledger. The reckoning for Colonel Hendricks was happening in a small, windowless office at the Pentagon, 3 levels below the ground. He sat across from a 3-star general and 2 JAG attorneys who looked at him with the same clinical detachment a coroner looks at a body. Hendricks had been a rising star, a man who had staked his entire career on the Vanguard partnership. Now he was a liability. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse him of treason. They simply laid out the timeline. They showed him the data stream Elena had released, the unencrypted proof of Vanguard's unauthorized subsurface testing. They showed him the casualty list that didn't officially exist. "The problem, Bill," the general said, his voice as smooth as polished stone, "is not that you were wrong. The problem is that you were caught being wrong by a staff sergeant with a high school diploma and a screwdriver. You allowed a single-point failure to compromise a decade of research. We can't have that." Hendricks looked at the gray carpet, the weight of his own choices finally settling into his marrow. He had ignored Elena's warnings because he had wanted the future to be clean and automated. He had wanted a war where he didn't have to worry about the human variable. And now, that variable was the only reason the base at Bagram hadn't been swallowed by the earth. He thought about Elena's hands, the way the skin had smoked as she held the radio wires. He thought about the dog, Buster, standing over the wounded corporal. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had never actually been a soldier. He had been a manager, and he had just been fired by the company he served. "I did what I thought was best for the mission," Hendricks whispered, but even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. "The mission is whatever we say it is," the general replied. "You're taking an early retirement, Bill, medical reasons, stress of command. You'll get your pension, but you'll never step foot in a secure facility again. If you so much as mention the word Vanguard in a bar, you'll find out just how quiet we can make a man." The reckoning for the others, the contractors, the mid-level officers who had laughed at Elena's interference, was equally cold. They were reassigned to dead-end posts in the Aleutian Islands or Thule, their careers hitting a wall that they would never climb over. It wasn't a public shaming. It was a quiet, procedural erasure. The military didn't want a villain. It wanted the story to stop breathing. Back at the station, the silence was beginning to change. Elena's hearing, which had been a dull roar of white noise for weeks, was sharpening into something predatory. She could hear the air conditioning in the hallway, 3 rooms away. She could hear the heartbeat of the guard outside her door, a rhythmic asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk that told her he was bored, his mind drifting to his weekend plans. One night, a month into her stay, she sat up in bed and realized she could hear the mountain itself. It was a low-frequency groan, the sound of tectonic plates shifting under the weight of the Appalachian Range. It was the same sound she had heard in the Gumbad, but deeper, older. She wasn't supposed to have access to any technology, but the listeners, the analysts who worked in the levels below her, didn't realize that she didn't need a radio to hear them. She could hear the electronic hum of their servers through the ventilation shafts. She could hear the high-pitched whine of their monitors. She began to map the facility in her mind, not by its layout, but by its frequencies. The station was a giant ear, a multi-billion-dollar collection of antennas and sensors designed to catch the whispers of the world, and Elena was the only thing inside it that actually understood what it was hearing. The personal cost of her isolation hit her hardest on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week the orders had arrived for Bagram. She was in physical therapy, her hands trembling as she tried to screw a nut onto a bolt. Sarah was watching her, her clipboard ready. "Take your time, Elena," the therapist said. "I don't have time," Elena replied, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, like it belonged to someone else. She thought about Styx. She wondered if he was in Montana yet. She wondered if he still had the scar on his forehead from the explosion. She could see him in her mind, standing on a ridge with Buster at his side, looking out over a forest that wasn't full of ghosts. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for the life she had lost, but for the fact that he was the only person who knew she wasn't crazy. He was the only one who had seen her in the red. And now he was gone, replaced by a gray fleece and a room that smelled like nothing. She had saved his life, and the cost was that she could never see him again. The institution had paid her in safety, and the price was her humanity. The Vanguard lawyers arrived on the third month. They didn't come to her room. She was taken to a secure briefing area where the lights were too bright and the air was too cold. There were 3 of them, men in suits that cost more than an LMTV, their faces masks of legalistic aggression. They didn't care about the Gumbad. They cared about the proprietary data stream she had leaked to the world. "Staff Sergeant Vance," the lead lawyer began, his voice like a velvet-covered razor. "You are in possession of intellectual property that belongs to the Vanguard Corporation. The sovereignty protocols you exposed are protected under a Tier 1 defense contract. Your actions caused a market loss of $4 billion in a single afternoon." Elena looked at him, her scarred hands folded on the table. She didn't feel intimidated. She felt a profound, weary contempt. "The property you're talking about tried to kill 200 American soldiers," she said. "The property was undergoing a field test that you interfered with," the lawyer snapped. "We have the right to seek damages. We could tie you up in civil court for the rest of your natural life. We could make sure you never own so much as a used car." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Or you can sign the non-disclosure agreement. You can acknowledge that what you saw was a hallucination caused by a traumatic brain injury. You can walk away from this with your pension intact." Elena looked at the paper he slid across the table. It was 50 pages of legalese, a document designed to swallow her whole. She thought about her father's screwdriver, the way it had felt in her hand as the ghosts closed in. She thought about the truth, that fragile, high-frequency thing that nobody seemed to want. She looked the lawyer in the eye and did something she hadn't done since she arrived at the station. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was a quiet, jagged sound that filled the room like the crackling of dry leaves. "You think I care about a pension?" she asked. "You think I care about a car? I've spent my life listening to the things people like you are too afraid to hear. Go ahead. Sue me, put me on a stand. Let me tell a jury about the black armor machines that liquefy organs with sound. Let's see what that does to your stock price." The lawyer's face went pale. He looked at the guards, then at the camera in the corner of the room. He realized in that moment what Hendricks had realized. You cannot threaten a person who has already lost everything they value. Elena Vance was not a soldier who could be intimidated by a paycheck. She was a woman who lived in the frequency of the truth, and the truth didn't negotiate. The meeting was over 10 minutes later. The lawyers left with their briefcases and their threats, and Elena was taken back to her room. But something had changed. The control she had been maintaining, the controlled rage, was beginning to sharpen into a weapon. She realized that the institution wasn't just holding her, it was hiding from her. They were afraid of what she knew, They were afraid of what she could hear. A week later, Director Vance returned. She found Elena in the medical ward, standing by the window that wasn't a window, but a high-resolution screen showing a live feed of the forest outside. The director didn't look like she had slept in days. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her sharp gray bob was slightly disheveled. She didn't sit down. "The Vanguard litigation has been handled," the director said. "They've dropped the suit. In exchange, the government has agreed to settle their losses under a classified force majeure clause. You're officially a ghost now, Elena. On paper, you don't exist." "I never did," Elena said, not turning from the screen. "I have something for you," the director said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, battered metal box. Elena recognized it instantly. It was the tool kit from her LMTV, the one that had been crushed in the explosion. The director set it on the bed. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the screwdriver. It had been cleaned, the rust removed, the wooden handle polished until it shone like mahogany. Elena touched the cold steel of the tool, her fingers tracing the familiar weight of it. It was a piece of her father, a piece of her past. It was the only thing in this sterile, silent world that felt real. "The corporal sent it," the director whispered. "He wouldn't tell us how he got it. He just said it belonged to the best soldier he ever knew." Elena felt a lump in her throat, a sudden, sharp pressure that threatened to break her composure. She didn't cry. She just gripped the screwdriver until her knuckles went white. Asterisk sticks. Asterisk, he was out there, he was remembering. "There's a new signal, Elena," the director said, her voice changing, becoming professional again. "It's coming from the North Sea, it's not Vanguard. It's not ours. It's a low-frequency pulse, 4 hertz repeating every 68 seconds. Our analysts think it's a whale migration. Our AI thinks it's tectonic noise." She paused, looking at Elena's back. "But the mountain is ringing, Elena. Since you arrived, the Blue Ridge sensors have been picking up a sympathetic resonance. It's like the mountain is trying to answer the signal, and we don't know why." Elena turned around then. She looked at the director, and for the first time she saw the fear in the older woman's eyes. It wasn't the fear of an enemy. It was the fear of the unknown. "It's not a whale," Elena said, her voice low and certain. "And it's not the mountain. Then what is it?" "It's a countdown," Elena said. "I heard it in the gumbad. It's the same harmonic. They didn't just build a board, director." They opened a door, and something on the other side just realized the lock is broken. The silence in the room became a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight that settled over both of them. The institution had tried to silence the woman, but in doing so, they had given her the ultimate listening post. They had built a multi-billion-dollar ear and put the only person who knew how to use it in the center of the drum. "Show me the data," Elena said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The director hesitated for a heartbeat, her loyalty to the institution warring with her instinct for survival. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. She handed it to Elena, her fingers trembling slightly. Elena took the device, her scarred fingers moving across the screen with a dark, terrifying competence. She didn't look at the graphs or the numbers. She looked at the raw waveforms. She saw the 4 hertz pulse. She saw the way it was structured, not like a signal, but like a heartbeat. A slow, steady, mechanical heartbeat that was getting faster. As she watched the data, she felt the floor beneath her boots begin to vibrate. It was a tiny movement, a microscopic tremor that no sensor in the facility would catch for another hour. But Elena felt it. She felt it in her marrow. She felt it in the scars on her hands. The reckoning was coming, and it wasn't going to happen in a courtroom or a Pentagon office. It was going to happen in the dark, in the deep places of the world where the frequencies lived. The institution had spent decades trying to control the world through technology, through automation, through the erasure of the human variable. And now, that variable was the only thing that could hear the end of the world coming. "They're coming back," Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Who?" the director asked, her voice barely a breath. "The things that built the ghosts," Elena said. "The things Vanguard was trying to talk to. They are not in the ground anymore, director. They are in the water." She handed the tablet back to the director, her face a mask of controlled, icy resolve. She felt the weight of the screwdriver in her hand, a physical anchor in a world that was about to go digital. She wasn't a patient anymore. She wasn't a ghost. She was a soldier on the edge of a war that nobody else even knew had started. "I need a radio," Elena said. "A real one, and I need a flight to the coast." "I can't do that, Elena. The protocols—" "Forget the protocols," Elena snapped, her voice like a whip. "In 6 hours, that 4 hertz signal is going to hit 14.2. That's the resonance frequency of the Atlantic shelf. If you don't get me to a transmitter that can punch through that harmonic, the shelf is going to slide. You won't have a coast to fly to." The director stared at her, the full weight of the situation finally landing. She looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the woman who had stood in the middle of a runway and screamed back at the earth. She saw the dark competence, the loyalty to the mission, the absolute, unwavering knowledge of a person who was right when the rest of the world was wrong. "The van is still in the garage," the director said. "I'll clear the gate, but if we do this, Elena, there's no coming back. You'll be a fugitive. They'll call it a kidnapping. They'll call it treason." "They already called me a ghost," Elena said, a small, jagged smile touching her lips. "You can't kill what's already dead." She turned toward the door, her pace steady, her mind already moving into the red. She could hear the facility waking up, the alarms beginning to chime in the lower levels as the first sensors caught the tremor. She could hear the guards moving in the hallway, their boots heavy on the concrete. She could hear the mountain groaning, a deep, ancient sound of warning. She stepped out into the hallway, the director at her side, and for the first time in months, Elena Vance felt alive. The cost had been high, her hands, her career, her name, but the mission was still there. The truth was still there, and she was the only one who could hear it. As they moved toward the elevator, the lights in the hallway flickered. The 4 hertz pulse was getting stronger, a rhythmic asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk that was beginning to slave the facility's electronics to its beat. Elena didn't need the tablet to know the count. She could feel it in her heart. Asterisk 5 hours, 52 minutes. Asterisk they reached the garage, the air tasting of exhaust and damp concrete. The black SUV was waiting, its engine idling with a low-frequency hum that Elena's brain automatically translated into a 60 hertz baseline. She climbed into the back seat, the screwdriver gripped in her scarred hand, her eyes fixed on the dark tunnel of the exit. "Where are we going?" the director asked, her hand on the steering wheel. "The Virginia coast," Elena said. "There's a Navy transmitter at Dam Neck. It's old, it's powerful, and it's tuned to the VLF bands. If I can get into the amplifier, I can disrupt the pulse." "And if you can't?" Elena looked out the window as the SUV surged forward, the gravel grinding beneath the tires. She thought about Styx. She thought about the ridge in Montana. She thought about the sound of the wind through the pines. "Then the world is going to get very quiet," she said. The SUV burst out of the garage and onto the winding mountain road, the morning sun hitting the windshield with a blinding white glare. Elena didn't close her eyes. She watched the road, her mind already mapping the route, her ears tuned to the low-frequency heartbeat of the world. She was Staff Sergeant Elena Vance. She was a sensor. She was a ghost. And she was the only thing standing between the silence and the scream. As they descended the mountain, the radio in the SUV began to crackle. It wasn't static. It was a voice, low, distorted, buried under layers of electronic noise. It was a frequency Elena hadn't heard in years, a specific encrypted band that only the Tier 1 units used. "Sarge, do you copy?" Elena's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. She knew the rhythm of it, the specific harmonic of the breath between the words. "Styx," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the dashboard. "We're here, Sarge, in the trees. We've been waiting for the signal." Elena looked at the dense forest passing by, her eyes searching for a flash of tan, a movement in the shadows. She felt a surge of hope, a small, white-hot spark in the center of her chest. She wasn't alone. The institution had tried to erase them, but the loyalty they had earned in the dirt of Bagram was stronger than any NDA. "Get to the coast, Styx," she said, her voice dropping into that low, controlled register that brooked no argument. "The frequency is 14.2. Meet me at the tower. Copy that, Sarge. See you at the finish line. The radio went dead, the silence rushing back in. Elena sat back in the seat, her hand still gripping the screwdriver. She felt the vibration of the earth, the steady, rhythmic asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk of the countdown. She felt the weight of the mission, the cost of the truth, and the absolute, unwavering certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she had to do. The road to the coast was long, and the world was beginning to shake. But as the SUV sped toward the horizon, Elena Vance didn't look back. She just listened. And in the silence of the Virginia morning, she heard the first note of the end of the world. It was a beautiful song. And she was the only one who knew how to stop it. The SUV hammered through the back roads of West Virginia, the director driving with a desperate, white-knuckled focus that Elena admired. They bypassed the main highways, sticking to the veins of the map, routes that didn't have cameras, roads where the only witnesses were the deer and the occasional rusted-out pickup truck. Every hour, the vibration in the floorboards grew more pronounced. It was no longer just a tremor. It was a physical presence, a hum that made the teeth ache and the vision blur. Elena sat in the back, her eyes closed, her mind a vast, topographical map of the seismic waves rippling out from the North Sea. She could hear the institution waking up behind them. The director's phone had been buzzing incessantly for the last hour, calls from Langley, from the Pentagon, from the Puzzle Palace at Fort Meade. They knew she was gone. They knew she had the director. To them, it looked like a mental break, a rogue asset kidnapping a high-level official. They didn't have the sensors to see what Elena saw. They were looking at a satellite map while she was feeling the heartbeat of the tectonic plates. "They're tracking the GPS," the director said, her voice tight with panic. "They'll have a block on the Richmond bypass in 20 minutes. "Turn the phone off," Elena said, not opening her eyes. "And take the next left onto Route 60. There's a dead zone in the valley. We'll switch cars at the trailhead." "How do you know there's a trailhead?" "I can hear the wind through the power lines," Elena said. "They're humming at 50 hertz, which means they are underloaded. There's no town ahead, just a maintenance shack." "We take the truck." The director did as she was told. She was a woman of intelligence, a woman who had spent her life managing data, but in the face of Elena's dark competence, she had become a student. She saw the way Elena operated, not with instinct, but with a terrifyingly precise application of sensory data. Elena wasn't guessing. She was calculating the world in real time. They reached the trailhead 10 minutes later. A rusted-out Ford F-150 was parked behind a stand of weeping willows, a man in a flannel shirt and a baseball cap standing next to it. As the SUV pulled up, the man turned. It was Styx. He looked thinner than he had in Afghanistan, his face more lined, his eyes more haunted. But when he saw Elena climb out of the SUV, his expression softened into a look of pure, unadulterated relief. He didn't say a word. He just walked over and pulled her into a brief, crushing hug. He smelled of pine needles and old oil, the smell of Montana. "You're late, Sarge," he whispered. "The mountain was loud," Elena replied, pulling back to look at him. And then a tan blur exploded from the truck's bed. Buster hit Elena's chest with the force of a breaching charge, his tail a frantic whip, his tongue a wet, warm sandpaper on her face. Elena fell back against the SUV, her hands buried in the dog's thick fur, her first real smile in months breaking across her face. The dog wasn't shivering anymore. He was vibrating with the same frequency as the earth, his ears pinned back, his eyes fixed on Elena with a terrifying loyalty. He knew, he had always known. "We have to move," Styx said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. "The MPs are 10 minutes behind you. I saw a Blackhawk over the valley 5 minutes ago." "The director is coming with us," Elena said. Styx looked at the older woman, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "She a friendly?" "She's the one who gave me the screwdriver," Elena said. Styx nodded once, a soldier's acceptance. "Get in, we're taking the logging roads." The transition to the truck was seamless. They left the SUV idling in the trees, a decoy for the GPS trackers, and surged back into the forest. Styx drove the old Ford with a reckless, practiced ease, slamming the gears as they climbed the muddy tracks that bypassed the Richmond blockade. Elena sat in the middle, Buster's head resting on her thigh, the director on her other side. The cabin of the truck was small and cramped, but for the first time since the explosion at Bagram, Elena felt like she was in the right place. The personal cost of the last few months seemed to fall away in the presence of her team. The scars on her hands didn't hurt as much. The silence in her ears wasn't as heavy. She was no longer a ghost. She was a sergeant again, a leader with a mission and a crew who would follow her into the dark. "The signal is at 13.6 hertz, Elena said, her voice cutting through the roar of the engine. "We have 3 hours. What happens at 14.2? Styx asked. "The Atlantic shelf liquefies," Elena said. "The VLF pulse from the North Sea is perfectly tuned to the quartz content of the submarine granite. It's called a piezoelectric cascade. Once the shelf starts to move, the water follows. It'll be a tsunami the size of the East Coast." The director gasped, her face pale. "Why would they do that?" "Who is they?" "It's not who, it's what," Elena said. "The Gumbad wasn't a mine, it was a beacon. Vanguard wasn't talking to people. They were talking to an automated defense system that's been dormant for 10,000 years. When we blew the bore at Bagram, we sent a system failure alert through the crust. The North Sea pulse is the reset button." "A reset button that wipes us out," Styx muttered. "Exactly," Elena said. "They reached the outskirts of Dam Neck at 0200. The Navy base was a sprawling complex of hangars and satellite dishes, but the VLF transmitter was located on a lonely spit of sand 2 miles to the south. It was a massive, skeletal tower that reached 300 feet into the salt-heavy air, surrounded by a double-layer chain-link fence and a small guard shack. The vibration was everywhere now. The sand on the dunes was dancing in geometric patterns, the rhythmic asterisk thump-thump-thump asterisk of the pulse shaking the very air. Elena could hear the ocean, not the sound of the waves, but the sound of the water under the surface, a deep, churning groan that told her the shelf was already beginning to fracture. "How do we get in?" Styx asked, pulling the truck to a stop behind a dune. "We don't," Elena said, looking at the tower. "The guards are just kids. They don't know what they're sitting on. If we try to breach, they'll call for backup and we'll be pinned down before I can even find the frequency." "Then what?" Elena reached into the toolkit and pulled out the screwdriver. She looked at the director. "You're the director of ONI. You're going to walk up to that shack and tell them you're here for an emergency inspection of the VLF array. Tell them the satellite links are down and you need the manual override." "They won't believe me," the director said. "I don't have the codes. My clearance was flagged the moment I left the station." "They don't know that yet," Elena said. "The bureaucracy is slow. Use the voice. I'm the most important person in the room voice. You have 5 minutes." The director took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Elena's. She saw the cold, controlled certainty in the younger woman's gaze, and for a second she saw the woman Elena could have been if the institution hadn't broken her. She saw the leader. "I'll do it," the director said. She stepped out of the truck, straightened her suit, and began to walk toward the guard shack. Her pace was measured, her head held high, the image of institutional power. Elena and Styx watched from the dunes, Buster crouched low between them, his hackles raised. "She's got guts," Styx whispered. "She's a Vance," Elena replied, "even if it's just a name." They watched as the guard stepped out of the shack, his rifle held at the low ready. There was a brief, tense conversation. The director pointed at the tower, her voice carrying over the sound of the wind. She gestured toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to gray the sky. The guard hesitated, then reached for his radio. He spoke for a moment, looked at the director again, and then stepped back. The gate began to slide open. "Go," Elena said. They didn't use the truck. They moved across the sand like shadows, Elena leading the way, her mind focused on the 13.6 hertz hum of the tower. She could feel the power radiating from the structure, a massive, invisible field of electromagnetic energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the only thing that could talk back to the North Sea. They reached the base of the tower just as the sirens began to wail at the main base. The institution had caught up. "Get to the perimeter," Elena commanded Styx. "Hold them off as long as you can. Use the flares, anything to keep them from the control room." "What about you, Sarge?" "I'm going to sing," Elena said. She climbed the ladder to the control room, the metal cold and vibrating under her hands. The room was small, filled with racks of vacuum tubes and ancient clicking relays, technology from a different era, built to survive a nuclear war. It was exactly what she needed. She didn't look at the dials. She didn't look at the manuals. She reached into the main cabinet and ripped the cooling shroud off the power amplifier. The smell of ozone and hot copper filled the room, a sensory trigger that brought her straight back to the cab of the LMTV at Bagram. She felt the red descend, the world narrowing into a series of interconnected systems. She saw the VLF signal, a raw, unmodulated wave that was being pumped into the ocean floor. She saw the North Sea pulse, a jagged, predatory rhythm that was trying to tear the shelf apart. She took the screwdriver and jammed it into the primary tuning coil. The sparks showered her arms, the smell of burning skin returning, but Elena didn't flinch. She was the transducer. She was the sensor. She felt the 13.6 hertz pulse in her own heart, and she began to turn the coil, her scarred fingers moving with a dark, terrifying precision. She wasn't just tuning a radio, she was tuning the Earth. Asterisk 13. 8, 13, 9, 14, 0. Asterisk outside, she could hear the roar of engines, the shouting of men, the rhythmic asterisk thud 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 asterisk of a helicopter. She could hear Stick's MP5 barking in short, controlled bursts, a rhythmic counterpoint to the siren. She could hear Buster's bark, a low, guttural warning that cut through the noise. "Almost there," she whispered, her teeth gritted against the pain. The 14.2 hertz pulse hit. The Earth didn't just shake, it roared. A massive tectonic groan erupted from the ocean, a sound so deep it wasn't heard. It was felt in the bone. The tower swayed, the metal screaming under the pressure. In the North Sea, the shelf was beginning to slide. The water was beginning to rise. Elena pushed the screwdriver deeper into the coil, her blood dripping onto the hot metal, her scream lost in the electronic howl of the transmitter. She wasn't just disrupting the signal, she was creating a counter-harmonic, a stop note that would freeze the piezoelectric cascade at the source. "Now!" she shrieked. The world went white. A wall of blue light erupted from the tower, a localized electromagnetic pulse that shorted out every electronic system within 10 miles. The sirens died. The helicopter fell from the sky, its engines dead. The radios went silent, and then the sound stopped. The North Sea pulse vanished. The tectonic groan died into a low, fading echo. The water, which had been beginning to mound on the horizon, slumped back into the sea. The shelf held. Elena fell back against the wall, her hands charred and smoking, her chest heaving with shallow, ragged gasps. She looked at her fingers, the silver scars now blackened and raw, and she felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had done it. She had heard the end of the world, and she had told it to be quiet. She heard footsteps on the ladder, not the heavy, rhythmic beat of a soldier, but the light, quick step of someone who was afraid. "Elena!" The director appeared in the doorway, her face covered in soot, her suit torn. She looked at the smoldering amplifier, then at the woman sitting in the middle of the wreckage. "It stopped," the director whispered. "The sensors. They just went flat. It's over." Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her ears were ringing with a thick, heavy silence that felt like a physical weight. She looked out the window at the gray Atlantic morning, the waves calm and indifferent, the sky a pale, bruised purple. She felt the weight of the screwdriver in her lap. It was hot, the metal glowing with a faint blue light. She had saved the world, and in doing so, she had finally, irrevocably erased herself. There would be no medals for this. There would be no reports. The institution would come for her now, and they would bury her in a hole so deep that not even the mountain could hear her. She looked at the director, and for a single, perfect moment, she saw the truth in the older woman's eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pity. It was all, "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Elena asked, her voice a dry rattle. "Yes," the director said. "The MPs are at the gate. The SecNav is on a direct line. They're calling it a terrorist attack." Elena stood up, her body stiff and broken, her mind already beginning to map the new silence. She looked at the door, then at the window, then at the screwdriver. "Then let them come," Elena said. She turned toward the door, her pace steady, her head up. She wasn't a staff sergeant. She wasn't a ghost. She was the woman who heard the truth, and she was done being quiet. As the first of the MPs burst into the room, their rifles leveled, their faces masks of institutional rage, Elena Vance didn't move. She just stood in the center of the wreckage, her scarred hands empty, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She heard the sound of their hearts. She heard the hum of their radios. She heard the world breathing, a slow, steady, beautiful rhythm that was finally, mercifully in tune. And as the darkness closed in, she smiled. She was right. She had always been right. And in a world that was about to be reborn in the silence, that was the only thing that mattered. The first thing Elena Vance felt after the blue light of the pulse faded was the weight of the screwdriver, a hot, heavy ghost of her father's hands, slipping from her blackened fingers to the cold linoleum floor of the control room. It made a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo forever in the vacuum created by the electromagnetic surge, a small, stubborn noise in a world that had suddenly gone perfectly, terrifyingly still. The soldiers who hit the room didn't come in with words. They came in with the smell of heavy polyester, the mechanical clatter of plates against carriers, and the overwhelming scent of gun oil and sweat. They were screaming, their mouths moving in wide, aggressive arcs, but Elena heard none of it. Her world was a muffled roar of static, the kind of silence you find at the bottom of a deep well, and she watched them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a new species. They tackled Sticks near the door, 3 men pinning him into the salt-crusted floorboards, and for a second she saw his eyes, not afraid, just incredibly tired. Then a gloved hand gripped her shoulder, the pressure grinding the charred skin of her collarbone, and the floor of the damn neck transmitter came up to meet her face with the taste of copper and dust. The transit from the coastal tower to the black site in Northern Virginia was a blur of high-frequency vibrations and the smell of industrial-grade plastic. They didn't put her in a standard prisoner transport. They put her in the back of a modified Stryker, the interior lit by a sickly red tactical light that made the blood on her hands look like oil. She was zip-tied, her wrists positioned in a way that forced the raw nerves of her palms against the plastic, a constant, sharp reminder that she was still alive. Every time the vehicle hit a pothole, the resonance of the armor plates hummed in her skull at 42 hertz, a low-frequency moan that told her the weld on the rear hatch was beginning to fatigue. She sat there, her back against the vibrating steel, and closed her eyes. She didn't think about the lawyers. She didn't think about the treason charges the director had warned her about. She thought about the Atlantic shelf, 30 miles out and 2 miles down, and how it was no longer sliding. She thought about the millions of people in the Tidewater Basin who were waking up to a Tuesday morning that should have been their last, complaining about the power outage and the weird blue flash in the sky, never knowing that a staff sergeant with a screwdriver had held the earth together for them. The facility they took her to smelled of fresh paint and ozone. It was a subterranean level of the Pentagon, or perhaps a satellite office in Arlington. It didn't matter. The architecture of the institution was always the same. Windowless hallways, heavy doors with magnetic locks that clicked like a hammer falling on an empty chamber, and the low, constant hum of a multi-billion-dollar HVAC system. They didn't take her to a hospital. They took her to a room with a single metal table bolted to the floor and a chair that was designed to be uncomfortable after 15 minutes. A man in a Navy uniform, a captain with 3 rows of ribbons and eyes like gray slate, sat across from her. He didn't have a name tag. He didn't have a file. He just had a digital recorder and a glass of water that he didn't offer to her. For the first 48 hours, nobody spoke. They let the silence do the work, a psychological tactic designed to break a person who lived in their own head. But they didn't understand that Elena had spent her life in the silence. She spent the time mapping the room. The fluorescent light above her was vibrating at 60 hertz, but it had a slight flicker, a micro-fluctuation that suggested the ballast was 5 years past its replacement date. The air vent in the corner was pulling air at a rate that indicated a high-efficiency filter, likely a MERV 16. She could hear the pulse of the guard outside the door, a steady 72 beats per minute, which dropped to 64 when he leaned against the wall to rest his lower back. She wasn't a prisoner in that room. She was the most advanced sensor the United States military had ever produced, and she was simply collecting data. When the captain finally spoke, his voice was a low-frequency rasp that felt like sandpaper on her raw nerves. You caused $12 billion in damage to the VLF array at Dam Neck, Sergeant. You bypassed 3 layers of security, kidnapped a senior intelligence official, and triggered a localized EMP that fried the avionics of an MH-60 Seahawk. Do you have any idea how many years you're going to spend in Leavenworth for this? Elena looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice coming out as a dry whisper. The Seahawk pilot is fine. He auto-rotated into the surf. I heard the rotors hit the water. It was a clean landing. The captain's jaw tightened. That's not the point. The point is that you're a rogue actor who interfered with a classified Tier 1 defense operation. Vanguard is demanding your head on a platter. The Secretary of Defense is asking why a staff sergeant with a history of insubordination was allowed anywhere near a national strategic asset. Vanguard is gone, Elena said. The North Sea Pulse destroyed their proprietary subsurface sensors. They have nothing left to sell you. The sovereignty protocols are a heap of melted silicon and fried copper. If they're demanding my head, it's because I'm the only one who can explain why their billion-dollar machines started screaming back at them. You think this is a game? The captain leaned in, his shadow stretching across the metal table. You're being charged with domestic terrorism. You're being charged with the theft of government property. You're being charged with the unauthorized disclosure of classified data. I saved the coast, Elena said. She didn't say it with pride. She said it as a matter of fact, the way an engineer explains a math problem. The 14.2 Hertz harmonic was reached. If I hadn't jammed the coil, the shelf would have moved. You'd be underwater right now, Captain. This room would be a tomb. The only reason you're sitting there threatening me is because I gave you a world to sit in. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tactical. It was the silence of a man who realized he was arguing with a force of nature. The captain looked at Elena's hands, the thick white bandages that covered the blackened skin, the way her fingers didn't quite close into a fist. He saw the cost of what she had done, and for a split second something flickered in his eyes. It wasn't sympathy. It was recognition. He had seen this look before, usually on the faces of men who had jumped on grenades to save a squad they didn't even like. It was the look of a soldier who had made a choice and was perfectly comfortable living with the consequence of it. The personal cost of the reckoning arrived on the 3rd day in the form of a woman who wasn't wearing a uniform. She was older, with a sharp, bobbed haircut and a suit that cost more than Elena's annual salary. She didn't sit down. She stood by the door watching Elena with the clinical detachment of a buyer inspecting a damaged piece of art. The director is being forced into early retirement, the woman said. She's being stripped of her security clearances and her pension. She's taking the fall for your little excursion to the coast. Elena felt a sharp, cold prick of guilt, the first real emotion she had allowed herself since the tower. She did what she had to do. She committed treason, the woman snapped. And so did your friend, Corporal Reeves. He's currently in a brig at Quantico, waiting for a court-martial that will likely end in a dishonorable discharge and 10 years in a federal pen. Even the dog is being decommissioned. They're sending him to a kennel in Maryland to be evaluated for aggression. The mention of Buster was the crack in the armor. Elena's hand twitched on the table, the bandages rubbing against the metal with a dry, scratching sound. She thought about the dog sitting in a concrete run, his ears pinned back, his mind still tuned to the frequency of a woman who wasn't there. She thought about Styx, the man who had followed her into a war he didn't understand, simply because he believed in her. She had saved the world, but she had destroyed the people who mattered most. "What do you want?" Elena asked, her voice cracking. "The institution is in a difficult position, Elena," the woman said, her voice softening just enough to be dangerous. "On one hand, we have a catastrophic security breach and a massive loss of government property. On the other hand, we have the seismic data from the North Sea. Our analysts spent the last 48 hours looking at the numbers you produced at the tower. They don't want to admit it, but you were right. The shelf was moving, the pulse was real, and your stop note worked. She walked toward the table, her heels clicking on the floor with a rhythmic precision. We can't let the public know that a private corporation nearly caused a tectonic collapse of the Atlantic shelf. We can't let them know that our own defense systems were being used to trigger it. But we also can't let a woman like you walk around with that kind of knowledge in her head. So kill me, Elena said. It would be quieter. We considered it, the woman said, and the terrifying thing was that she wasn't lying. But the director made a deal before they took her away. She gave us the encryption keys to the black site servers in exchange for your life. She also made sure that the data you leaked to the press wasn't just sent to news outlets. It was sent to a secure, automated server that will release everything if your heart stops beating or if you're ever officially charged with a crime. Elena looked up, a surge of respect for the director hitting her. The older woman had played the game until the very end, using the only currency she had left to buy Elena a future. The deal is this, the woman continued. You're being medically discharged from the United States Army, effective immediately. You're receiving a general under honorable conditions discharge. No pension, no benefits, no VA care. You're being given a new identity, a small sum of cash, and a one-way ticket to wherever you want to go. In exchange, you sign the NDA. You never speak the word Vanguard again. You never talk about the Gumbad. You never touch a radio, a transmitter, or a piece of government hardware for the rest of your life. If you so much as hum a frequency that sounds like the North Sea pulse, we will find you and we will make you disappear. And Styx? Elena asked. And the dog? The corporal is being discharged for medical reasons. PTSD. He'll get his pension, but he'll never wear a uniform again. The dog. The dog is being released to his care. They're both being moved to a farm in Montana. The director made sure of that. Elena sat in the silence of the room, the 60 hertz hum of the light above her feeling like a heavy blanket. She thought about the cost. She was being erased. Her decade of service, her rank, her skills, her very name, it was all being scrubbed from the record. She was being turned into a ghost by the very machine she had saved. But she also thought about Styx on a ridge in Montana, with Buster at his side, watching a sunset that wasn't full of smoke. She thought about the silence of a life where nobody was screaming at her to find a signal. "Where's the paper?" Elena asked. The signing was a clinical affair. Her hands were too damaged to hold a pen properly, so she had to use a specialized grip, her scarred fingers trembling as she scrawled her name for the last time. Asterisk Elena Vance. Asterisk each letter felt like a piece of her skin being peeled away. When it was done, the woman in the suit took the paper, checked the signature, and nodded to the guard. "Your transport is waiting," the woman said. "Don't look back, Elena. The institution has a very long memory, and it doesn't like being reminded of its mistakes." They took her out through a loading dock at 0300, the air cold and smelling of damp asphalt. They didn't give her her uniform back. They gave her a pair of jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a pair of hiking boots. They handed her a small canvas bag with her personal effects, her father's screwdriver, a worn-out wallet with no ID, and a manila envelope with $10,000 in cash. They put her in the back of a plain white van with no windows, and for 4 hours she sat in the dark, listening to the tires on the highway. The van stopped in a small, dusty town in West Virginia, a place that felt like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The driver, a man she had never seen before, opened the door and pointed toward a rusted-out bus station. "Your ticket is at the counter," he said. "The bus leaves in 20 minutes. It goes to Denver. From there, you're on your own." Elena climbed out of the van, her legs stiff, her body aching with exhaustion that felt permanent. She watched the van pull away, the red taillights disappearing into the early morning mist. She stood there for a long time, the canvas bag heavy in her hand, the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves filling her lungs. It was a beautiful, ordinary American morning, the kind of morning where nothing happens and everything is possible. The bus station was a small, brick building with a linoleum floor that was worn through to the concrete in front of the ticket window. The man behind the glass was old, his skin like parchment, his eyes buried behind thick glasses. He didn't look at her hands. He didn't look at the scars on her face. He just took the voucher she handed him and slid a ticket across the counter. "Gate 2, he said. "Coffee's in the corner, nickel a cup." Elena walked to the corner and poured a cup of coffee. It was burnt and bitter, the steam hitting her face with a warmth that made her eyes sting. She sat on a plastic bench and looked out the window at the empty street. For the first time in 10 years, there was no mission. There was no enemy. There was no frequency she had to find. There was just the sound of the wind rattling the glass and the low, steady hum of the refrigerator in the back of the station. She reached into her bag and pulled out the screwdriver. The wood of the handle was smooth, the steel of the shaft still stained with the shadow of the blue light. She held it in her lap, her scarred fingers tracing the familiar shape of it. It was just a tool. It was just a piece of metal and wood. But it was the only thing she had left of the woman she used to be. The bus arrived at 06:30, a massive, silver beast that hissed with the sound of pneumatic brakes. Elena boarded, finding a seat in the back where she could press her head against the window. As the bus pulled out of the station and began the long climb into the mountains, she watched the town disappear. She watched the forests of the Blue Ridge give way to the rolling hills of the Ohio Valley. She watched the world pass by, a vast, beautiful landscape of strip malls and cornfields and small towns with names like Hope and Mercy. She didn't sleep. She spent the journey listening. She heard the rhythmic clatter of the bus's engine, a steady, comforting thrum that told her the valves were perfectly timed. She heard the chatter of the other passengers, a mother talking to her child, a man on a cell phone complaining about his job, two teenagers laughing about a movie. Their voices were a symphony of the ordinary, a high-frequency buzz of life that felt like a gift. They didn't know about the North Sea. They didn't know about the ghosts or the hole in the world at Bagram. They were just living their lives, unaware of the cost of the silence they were enjoying. The transfer in Denver happened in a terminal that smelled of pretzels and floor wax. She had 6 hours to kill before the next leg of her journey, so she walked. She walked through the crowds of travelers, her head down, her hands buried in the pockets of her sweatshirt. She saw a group of soldiers in the food court, their ACUs crisp and clean, their faces full of that specific youthful arrogance that she remembered so well. She stopped for a moment, watching them. They were talking about their upcoming deployment, their voices full of excitement and bravado. They looked at her, seeing only a tired woman in a gray sweatshirt, and then they looked away. They didn't see the staff sergeant. They didn't see the hero. They just saw a ghost. Elena felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, a hollow ache in her chest that felt like a wound. She wanted to walk over to them. She wanted to tell them to listen. She wanted to tell them that the world wasn't what they thought it was, that the machine they served was colder and more dangerous than any enemy they would ever face. But she didn't. She just turned away and kept walking. She was no longer part of that world. The mission was over. The final leg of the journey took her north into the big sky country of Montana. The air changed as they crossed the border. It became thinner, colder, tasting of snow and pine. The mountains here were different from the Appalachians. They were jagged and raw, their peaks hidden in the clouds like the teeth of some ancient beast. Elena sat by the window, her heart beginning to beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt in a long time. She got off the bus in Billings late on a Thursday evening. The station was quiet, the air biting with the first frost of autumn. She stood on the sidewalk, her breath a white plume in the air, and looked around. She didn't have an address. She didn't have a phone number. All she had was the name of a town 3 hours to the west, and a memory of a man who had promised to wait. She spent most of her remaining cash on a beat-up Jeep Cherokee she found in a classified ad. The engine had a slight knock in the second cylinder, a sound she could hear from 50 yards away, but the frame was solid and the tires were new. She bought a map, a box of granola bars, and a heavy wool blanket. Then she pointed the Jeep toward the mountains and drove. The road was long and winding, a ribbon of asphalt that cut through the heart of the wilderness. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, the stars beginning to flicker in the vast, empty space above. Elena felt the silence of the mountains pressing in on her, but for the first time it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like home. She could hear the world breathing here, the rustle of the wind through the pines, the distant roar of a river, the low, steady hum of the earth. It wasn't a warning, it was just a song. She reached the town of Paradise Valley at midnight. It was nothing more than a post office, a general store, and a handful of houses scattered along the riverbank. She drove slowly, her eyes searching the dark hills for a light, a sign, anything that would tell her she was in the right place. She felt a sudden wave of fear, a cold, sickening doubt that she had missed it, that the director had lied, that Styx was gone. And then she saw it. High on a ridge overlooking the river, a small cabin sat nestled in a grove of aspens. A single light was burning in the window, a warm, amber glow that felt like a beacon in the dark. Elena turned the Jeep onto the gravel driveway, the sound of the tires on the stone feeling like a heartbeat. She parked the car and sat there for a long time, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was afraid to get out. She was afraid that if she opened the door, the dream would vanish and she would be back in the windowless room in Virginia. The front door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the light. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the Jeep, his body tense. And then a tan blur exploded from his side. Buster hit the gravel with a frantic, joyful bark, his tail a whip, his body a golden streak in the moonlight. He didn't hesitate. He ran straight for the Jeep, his paws scratching at the door, his whining a high-pitched, desperate sound of recognition. Elena opened the door and fell out onto the ground, her hands buried in the dog's fur, her face pressed against his neck. She didn't cry. She just held him, her body shaking with a relief that felt like a physical weight being lifted from her soul. Buster licked her face, his tongue warm and sandpaper rough, his heart beating against her chest, in a rhythm she knew by heart. Styx walked down the steps, his pace slow and steady. He stopped a few feet away, looking at her with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask how she got there. He didn't ask about the deal. He just reached out and took her hand, her scarred, blackened hand, and held it with a gentleness that broke the last of her composure. "You're late, Sarge," he whispered. "The road was long," Elena replied, her voice breaking. He pulled her up and led her toward the cabin, the dog trotting at their side. The interior was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. There was a fireplace in the corner, a low fire crackling in the hearth. There were books on the shelves, a radio on the counter that was turned off, and a single battered metal tool kit sitting on the table. Elena sat on the couch, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the dog's head resting on her thigh. Styx sat next to her, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on the fire. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the gumbad. They didn't talk about the institution that had erased them. They just sat in the silence, a silence that they had earned in the dirt and the blood of a world that would never know their names. "I can still hear it," Elena said after a long time, her voice a low whisper. "The signal?" Styx asked. "No," Elena said, looking out the window at the starlit sky. "The world. I can hear the mountains shifting. I can hear the trees growing. I can hear the river." It's beautiful." Styx nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It's been waiting for you, Elena, we all have." The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet healing. Elena spent her days on the porch, watching the eagles circle the valley and the deer graze in the meadows. She worked in the garden, her scarred hands feeling the cool, damp earth, the physical labor a form of therapy that no hospital could provide. She didn't touch a radio. She didn't look at a computer. She lived in the frequency of the real world, the 1, 2 hertz of a deep breath, the 8, 0 hertz of a resting heart, the 440 hertz of a mountain bluebird's song. She and Styx developed a rhythm that required very few words. They were two people who had been broken by the same machine, and they found a quiet, unspoken comfort in each other's presence. They were no longer a sergeant and a corporal. They were just two humans trying to remember how to live in a world that wasn't trying to kill them. They hiked the ridges, Buster leading the way, his ears always alert, his body a silent guardian. They fished in the river, the cold water numbing their legs, the sound of the current a constant, soothing white noise. The personal cost of her service was still there, of course. Her hands would never fully recover. The nerves were too damaged, the skin too thin. She would always have the scars on her face, the silver lines that told the story of a night when the earth had tried to scream. And she would always carry the weight of the secrets she knew, the knowledge of the ghosts and the black armor machines that were still out there, buried in the dark places of the world. But the rage was gone. The controlled rage that had fueled her for a decade had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She had done her job. She had saved the people she could save. And she had walked away with her head up. One evening, a month after her arrival, Elena sat on the porch as the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes were large and wet, disappearing as they hit the ground, a silent white blanket that transformed the valley into a world of silver and shadow. Styx was inside, the sound of his guitar a low, melodic hum through the window. Buster was curled at her feet, his breath a steady, rhythmic sigh. Elena reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out the screwdriver. She looked at it for a long time, the steel gleaming in the twilight. She thought about her father, the man who had taught her how to listen. She thought about the LMTV in the desert, the transmitter at Dam Neck, and the blue light of the stop note. She realized that she didn't need the tool anymore. She wasn't a censor for the military. She wasn't a ghost for the institution. She was just Elena. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. She looked out over the valley, at the river and the mountains and the vast, empty sky. She felt the vibration of the world beneath her boots, a slow, steady heartbeat that was full of hope and grief and life. It was a beautiful song, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to change a single note of it. She pulled her arm back and threw the screwdriver as hard as she could. She watched it spin through the air, a flash of silver against the gray sky before it disappeared into the thick brush of the hillside. It didn't make a sound when it landed. It just vanished into the earth, returning to the silence where it belonged. Elena stood there for a long time, her hands empty, her heart full. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and she smiled. Inside the cabin, the radio on the counter, the one that had been dead for a month, suddenly flickered to life. It wasn't a signal from the institution. It wasn't a message from the director. It was just a stray frequency, a burst of static that caught a local station from across the mountains. A woman's voice, clear and bright, filled the room, singing a song about a long road home. Styx stopped playing his guitar and looked at the radio. He looked at Elena through the window, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and turned the volume up. Elena walked back into the cabin and closed the door, shutting out the cold and the snow. She sat down next to him, the dog's head on her knee, and they listened to the music together. It was an ordinary American song, played on an ordinary American radio in a small cabin in the heart of the mountains. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The world was still out there with its secrets and its wars and its high-frequency screams. The institution was still out there, rewriting the history of its mistakes and hunting for the next human variable. But in the quiet warmth of the cabin, none of that mattered. Elena Vance was no longer a ghost. She was a woman who had found her own frequency, a frequency that was quiet and steady and true. And as the fire in the hearth burned low, she realized that the silence she had fought so hard for wasn't a void. It was a beginning. The last of the snow fell against the window, a soft, scratching sound that was the only thing left of the storm. Elena closed her eyes and let the music carry her away, her mind finally, mercifully, at peace. She had heard the end of the world, and she had survived to tell the silence that it was okay to stay. The mountain groaned once, a deep, ancient sound of greeting, and then the valley was still. She was home.